There's 4 steps to understanding pawn structures like a GM. The first step is to know what the key pawn structures are that you should know. The second is to know the right ways to play those different pawn structures. The third is to build up experience playing those structures yourself, applying the ideas you've learned to really master them. And then the fourth is to really expand that pattern recognition from studying really high quality games in those pawn structures so that you can apply them without thinking at a level of unconscious competence in your games. Now, of course, pawn structures are a very broad topic, and it would not be feasible to cover all 4 of these steps in one video. But I'm Grandmaster Max Illingworth. I'm a past Australian chess champion, also a world-class chess coach, and also a high-performance coach. And I'll be taking you through the first 2 steps of this process so that you can start applying these ideas of pawn structures in your own games and greatly shorten your learning curve. Because I think when it comes to people wanting to understand chess like a GM, what they're really asking behind that is, well, what is the pattern recognition behind that? How can I play more from long-term memory? How can I make my moves so that instead of calculating all the details and having every single little thing to play a move with confidence, that I can have that intuitive feel of, okay, this move feels right in this sort of position, the way that GMs do automatically. So this topic, I'm actually dividing it into 2 parts because if it had been just all in one video, the video would have been over 2 hours long. And while that might be fun for some people to really dive deep into it, I do like to caress my voice as well. But this first part will be focusing on the structures that can arise from E4. Part 2 is going to cover some of the non-E4 structures. There is some overlap, like for example, if isolated means pawn structures, you will get them from both E4 and D4 as such. But the general idea, yeah, is still the same, of the structures that will arise a lot when you play the move of E4 as white. And we will be going pretty deep, so fasten your seatbelts, get ready for takeoff. And if you're enjoying the video, do make sure to leave a like and also subscribe for more like this one. It's your support that ultimately allows me to continue creating high quality chess content like this to solve your biggest chess problems and help you to improve a heck of a lot faster. So the first part I'll do is I'll actually show you the different kind of variations that lead to our structures, because if I just showed you the structures immediately, you might be wondering, well, how exactly do we get to this point? So it'll be easier to just show you the moves first without too much explanation. And it is a lot of variation, so do bear with me, but basically just going to show you how different structures arise so you can see why they're important. And we're going to start with the Roy Lopez as the first one. So I'm not going to explain these moves, or again, the video would be like 3+ hours if I explain all these variations. But one of the more famous E4 structures is the one where you do have that pawn to the center, and then later play the move on D5 to get that permanent space advantage. Also, another version is the exchange structure, where I go a little bit deeper actually, also going to the position with the pawn on d4 and yeah, looking into how these sort of endgames play out. Of course, very related to this is the Berlin endgame, which is virtually the same structure, but we'll see the pawn on e5 instead of e4 does make some quite substantial differences. There's also various versions you can get a more symmetrical structure, like with the rookie one anti-Berlin, where if I play out a few more moves, you'll kind of see it does eventually lead closer to a structure you could also get from like a French exchange and some other places. But again, there's different versions, or we'll get into it more in due course. I think for most of you watching this video, you'll probably actually get the Italian a bit more often. So it's definitely good to see how those structures play out and add a little bit more in depth into some of those different versions. Like, for example, this Steinitz structure with the extra space here, we will go into that. And also, since I mentioned the IQP structure before, it is good to show an example of that here when the IQP against the C-Pawn. We'll also see some versions later against the E-Pawn, just so you know. There's also the modern Italian with D3, where we'll see how these kind of C3 versus knight C6 structures play out. We'll also see what happens in the lines where they do try to take that space advantage in the center with D5. There's a few other versions, like there's also, yeah, the symmetrical center versions, or like just the wide open center. Those ones do tend to be more based on piece Play-Doh, so we'll probably spend a bit less time on this than some of the others that a bit more about the pawn breaks as well. Yeah, and also I didn't include it in the original file, but I will mention this one also as a bit of a bonus one that's like very fringe, but I think for those who do play this as white or black, it's like a really good structure to know about. Yeah, also there are different versions like the various Petrov structures of like C4, C6, and that kind of tension in the center. There are also some other ways you can also get the symmetrical structure, like here the pieces are placed a bit differently, but still same kind of basic concept. With that, we can move to some of the Sicilian type structures, and there's not an exhaustive list, but I think it covers the spectrum pretty well of different structures that can arise. If we just take the Najdorf as kind of our starting point, I'm working our way back. There's basically two types of Najdorf structures. There's the one with E5, and okay, if you want to get more concrete, there's also like English attack style approaches. We'll get into all of this later. And then there's also the Scheveningen structure of like E6, where again, depending on where the pieces are placed, it changes how they play out a little bit. Like this version, for example, is a little bit different to the Bishop G5 one. There's also the Rauzer structure, which is not just this Scheveningen, but where you have a later Bishop F6 and we have the double pawns on the F file for black. So very specific, but if you place either color, it's kind of important to know. Also within the dragon, you have like the Yugoslav structure of E4 versus D6, opposite side castling. And in what's kind of the main line these days with D5, you do get this structure where they have the isolated pawns, and there's different versions like with the pawn on E7. Also briefly with the pawn E5, but we will get into all of this. There's also the Maroczy structures where you end up putting your pawn on C4, so we'll kind of see the versions with the pawn on E5. We'll see the more flexible hedgehog style versions with the pawns on E6 and potentially B6. Also with bishop B5, there are different structures that arise here. Like for example, you might notice if we play out some moves, it's actually leading a bit more towards a French defense kind of structure. So I'll be covered more in the French section. Likewise, if you look at some structures like this, it's almost like white's kind of playing in a Roy Lopez style against Sicilian, where yeah, instead like E5, D5 pawns are a little bit flexible for black by comparison. But white does have the space to work with. Going to some other Sicilian variations, there's also the lines with knight C6. And this sort of brings back some memories of the Sveshnikov where there are probably some people who just skip the Sveshnikov structures a bit because there are so many different versions of the structures, but because it is a topic I'm passionate about and the Sveshnikov is a very mainline opening, I think it is good to kind of know the different versions of this kind of structure of like the D5 hole structures, as it were. Sometimes they're also called Boleslavsky hole, depending on the way in which you get them. And there's other versions, like we probably won't get into this one because it's a bit too specific, but it's another example of what that structure can look like in the Maroczy kind of version, as it were. Although normally the pawn's not on B4, so that's kind of the difference. There's also the old main line with bishop F6, where the two main structures you usually get are either the ones where you have like the 2-0 central majority, or such also we'll see different versions where they kind of take on D5. And this I've sort of decided not to cover as deeply, like I do touch on it, but is again very, very specific. But there are other versions of these ED5 structures, like this one does occur a lot. Also in various Najdorf middle games, and it's good to kind of know some of the different plans. Also very briefly just touch on like showing that this is sort of the dream structure in the open ceiling for black. You can trade their E4 pawn for your D5 pawn and video pawn in the center. This structure is kind of known as queen type majority structure. We'll actually see it in a lot of different versions and is one of the more common structures that arise via 1E4, so a very good one to know about. There's also different Maroczy bind structures like with C4 against G6 instead of E6 and E5, which does change contours a little bit. You also have like kind of classical dragon type structures where you have like white going for F4 rather than f3 as such. So that changes the play a little bit. This next one is one that you will virtually never see in books, but it's kind of one that you will get quite a lot in online games, like at the club online level, with like this sort of BC6 structure. It's a nice one for black betting. It's still good to know a bit how it plays out because I did get a lot online. And yeah, also like with E5, yeah, it's just going to basically be leading back to structures I already mentioned before. This is just a more common way to get it than say the pre-interracial F3 against D6 we saw earlier. So that covers, yeah, open Sicilian knight C6. I also realized that the Rossolimo actually leads to a lot of very rich structures as well. To give like a few examples, you can have this DC6 structure where, okay, whether the pawn's on E5 or E7, a lot of the time they end up playing E5 anyway. Like if we take this version, often they will have put the pawn E5 in the middle game just to have some space. But there's also different versions like B takes C6, and I don't really go this deep into the weeds of it necessarily, but this is like just showing one way you can get a structure where you like undouble the pawns, but you kind of get the space to sort of transform that advantage. Also with E6, there are some different versions like the bishop C6 and how some of these structures play out, and you know, some of the different pawn breaks that both sides can go for. Also, you know, the version with if we take like rook e1 and sort of old main line, and then yeah, you can kind of see that after some moves, we're actually heading back to the queenside majority structure with the queenside majority versus central majority. So that's just one of many ways in which you can get that structure. Also, yeah, some other versions like also if we take this as again kind of just it's getting very deep into the weeds, but I do want to show this as a little bit of an example of like one way in which you can kind of get a French defense structure from a Sicilian, just so you're kind of making those connections and realizing that the structure you might be learning in one opening might actually really help you for playing a different opening if there are sort of transitions between them structurally. Also, it is true there is I kind of called this the Botanic structure. I didn't really have the perfect name for it, but we do touch on. Yeah, these structures again with like the hold on D5, but like having a bit of space to make up for it. And that really leaves us then with the E6 Sicilians, which are quite flexible in nature, where for example in the Kann Sicilian you will often see white play the C4 and go for a Maroczy setup. It's going to kind of tie in quite well with the Maroczy Hedgehog coverage. Likewise with C4, you're kind of noticing similar kind of position. Well, some kind of structure will often be arising with this Hedgehog once again. And there's also other versions, like there's also, I've done a separate section actually on what I've called kind of the Kann version of the Scheveningen, because it does play a bit differently to the normal Najdorf Scheveningen or even Taimanov Scheveningen versions. Stuff like the four knight Sicilian, like even though this is a structure I touch on, it's not what I'm going to spend as much time on just because it's more about like getting piece play to compensate for the problems in that one structure, just so that kind of makes sense. With knight c6, yeah, there's different versions. Like you can go for a Maroczy bind in this way if it's not the best version of it for white. It is something that exists. And there's also like different versions, like different structures within the Taimanov. Though it is true these I haven't really covered as much because a lot of time they will sort of transpose back into Scheveningen style of structures. So I haven't covered it as deeply. It's maybe the biggest gap perhaps in the coverage, along with say, you know, the open roller pair structure. But yeah, you can't really cover everything without it being like a very, very long video. So also I do touch briefly on some anti-Sicilians. Like I do think that the Alakin Sicilian does lead to a lot of very interesting structures where, for example, like you have like this IQP structure that can arise with the against the E pawn, just to kind of reiterate that. Also, yeah, you have other ways you can play where, for example, if they go E d5 instead of Queen d5, it will also lead to that IQP structure. And I've actually decided to cover the IQP for white and IQP for black separately, just because I find they often play very differently with the extra tempo versus not. And I even do briefly touch on like the knight f6 elephant as well, just because it is a structure we'll get quite a bit in the Sicilian, so it's a good one to know. And also touch on the King's Indian attack structure, especially against the French, because in the versions where you don't play d5, it's often going to transpose into a different structure that we've seen elsewhere in a sense. So we do kind of cover how these sort of positions play out, and also the versions where white does play c4. like here, I do touch on that to give something a little bit more advanced for you. Um, and also, yeah, with the other Sicilian lines, like I briefly touch on the Grand Prix structure, but not really in too much depth because the kind of the ideas are usually fairly clear with it. And also with the close Sicilian, again, I could have covered this from an English opening move order as well, because it kind of comes up there probably more often these days. But I do kind of cover some of the different versions, like how these structures play out for both sides. And finally, yeah, just to give like another example, like this is just another way in which you can often get these kind of queenside majority structures from the Alpine Sicilian, either by them you taking on C5 or them taking you and you taking back with a piece, just so those connections are rather clear. Also, if we take some less common systems like the French can lead some quite interesting structures, and we've even kind of seen one or two of them come up from different openings actually. But the one I'd say is sort of that I naturally think of when I think of the French is going to be the sort of structures here, and there are a lot of different versions. I haven't just got sort of said, okay, this is a structure, but I do sort of explain what some of the differences are between them. Like, for example, what difference it makes when you have the pawn on f4 versus not, because it is actually quite a big difference as it turns out in how it plays out. Also, I do cover like what if they keep the tension, like a little bit of how the dynamics of that work in a sense. I also even cover some version of the structure, like where you have the pawn on e5 and you can't use it more as a strong point. And even some of the versions where the pawns do get trade off, I do touch a little bit on how these structures play, even though they are very, very specific. I think that the key to understanding how to play close positions well is knowing how to play them when they do open up. So that's why I made sure to touch on it here, even though it's a little bit niche. Also, I do cover these Rubinstein structures, but again, rather than just saying, okay, this is the Rubinstein structure and doing a chapter on it like most books do, I've actually gone deeper into the weeds, like going really into expertise the way a Grandmaster does, and just showing you the different versions that are kind of good to know. So, for example, what it means in the version where black has the bishop pair to make up for white's extra space. What about the Verne variation GF6, how having that kind of makes things a bit more dynamic. Also touch on even like how this sort of works with the tension between the pawns, kind of like what things to look out for before play kind of potentially heads into a queenside majority structure. So really kind of making it very granular and like one step at a time. I also even cover the McCutcheon structure. There's kind of more trendy ways to play it now than this line I'm showing you here, but kind of showing yeah how these structures play out, kind of like a good winnower where you didn't give up the bishop there. And speaking of the winnower, that's actually kind of our next structure with this version. And I go a little bit into yeah some of the details and something else I've done. Like I haven't done for every single one of these versions, but for a lot of them, I've kind of included the minor piece of balance of structure as well, because often a lot of what makes the structure really click is kind of that bishop versus knight imbalance, how it works in a player's favor depending on the position. So that is something I talk about as well. And you won't just improve your structural understanding, but also your minor piece of balance understanding as well from this training. Okay, the Rubinstein structure I already mentioned before. Also in 92, there are different versions of like 92 is quite a good system if you want to get kind of the queenside majority structure because you can get in a lot of different versions. Like even in the main line here, you're kind of seeing that same queenside majority structure come up. So I do talk a little bit about okay, what are some of the differences in this particular version? And also yeah, ED5 we kind of saw this from the Alakin version where okay, here the knight's on D2 instead of the pawn on C3, but yeah, similar kind of concepts. And also I do touch on the Taimanov structure with this BC6 and then having the pawn in the center. You can see here it also comes up French defense. So that leads us into the other main branch being really the Caro-Kann. And the Caro-Kann actually does lead to a very interesting range of structures where again I don't just sort of go surface level and say, okay, this is the Caro-Kann structure, these are some typical ideas. But I do actually break down some of the different versions depending on what structure you kind of get. Like for example, how after C5, like the way the structure often plays out is that the pawns get traded and you'll have C4 as a way to kind of use your leading development. So I kind of talk a little bit about how that plays out and what it means when these pawns get traded. Because that structure can also arise from the Alpha Sicilian, of course. Also talk a little about, okay, what happens if they don't play C5, and like a little bit about what the plans are there, how players kind of build up for the coming confrontation. I also share a bit about what difference it makes when H4, H5 is thrown in, just so you can kind of understand some of the subtleties behind some of these bottom tile lines. And also I do break down like what happens if these pawns get traded C4 and D5, because that is an idea that often underpins a lot of the other variations in the advanced Caro-Kann. And again, if we take the Botvinnik-Karls variation, we can kind of see, yeah, that it's going to be very similar to the structures we saw with the French, only this one perhaps being a bit of a better version. And with that, yeah, also knight c3, the sort of classical line. Even though this structure, yeah, is again a classic sort of Rubinstein style structure, if you like. What I've kind of observed is that there's actually a lot of differences with this structure compared to like the E6 version that we saw just before, because in the Kablanca Caracan, you get this version usually where you have the pawn on h5. There is also a version where you keep the pawn on h4, but h5 is sort of the classic one where you're sort of going to show basically that there are some advantages and also some disadvantages to having a pawn on h5 here as white. And of course, nowadays the Portugal line is the most trendy, so I mean, it's very important to definitely show some of the ideas of how these positions play out, like what both sides are aiming for, where black's compensation for the dominant pawns comes from, in a sense. And also we touch on the exchange Caro-Kann. Like these cast-bound lines, I'm not going to really focus on as much because they kind of fit better for D4, D5, where they come up a lot more often. So it's better for part two. But I do kind of touch a little bit on sort of what specifically makes this different compared to some of the other versions that we'll see in part two. So, and also with the panel, we can kind of see that the panel will often lead to these sort of IQP structures against the E pawns. It's a really great opportunity to see the ideas of how that plays out. And then also, yeah, there's a version of the panel where you play C5 and have that space advantage. It's not the most common structure, but I think it is a good one to touch on at least briefly. And the final Caro-Kann, well, actually, it's kind of two I'd decide to add. The first one was basically this two knights version, kind of seeing the differences between D3 and D4 and you know how that sort of plays out briefly. And I did ultimately decide to also include the D3, like even though this is getting very granular, I do think it is kind of good to see why this structure does give white good long-term chances. So I have touched on it really briefly. But also just to kind of wrap things up in terms of the different ways you can get these different structures, I've also included the knight c3, like some of the Pirc structures with, for example, what about like this e5 structure, which, okay, this one's a bit of a rarer version, but if you were to take a more common move order, you can kind of see how a similar structure comes up. So I have touched a little bit on how it's sort of different when the bishop is a bit stuck on G7 here. It's kind of unique to the Pircs. Also, I've touched a bit on like this structure where you get in the move D5 and what that sort of means in a sense. And I've also touched on like some more dynamic versions, like okay, what are some typical ideas when like the F3 versus C6 subs that you'll often see in the Pircs, especially at a higher level. Also, I've touched a bit on some Filidor ideas, such as in this Hand-Filidor, I have touched on kind of this structure and there's some different options, like if white plays a5, if black tries to stop it, just kind of break down some of those different points. I've even briefly included something on also like the positions with G4, which it's very dynamic, but I think it's still good to know a couple of pointers for how those can play out, because they are very different in nature to the short castle lines that we saw just then. In terms of the Hand-Filidor, or not the Hand, the Anderson-Filidor lines, I kind of call them like surrender the sense structures, where I kind of break down, yeah, sort of what kind of makes the different plans work with kingside castling, queenside castling for white, and what black can try to do about it. Yeah, I haven't really covered this symmetrical structure so much, just a little bit fringe, but just letting you know it does exist. And I do also touch on the Geller system, and there is a structure you can get in a lot of different versions, which is really kind of breaking down this sort of position, which you might notice is actually kind of very similar to an ideal Royal pairs or ideal Italian structure. But the bishop being on G7 does change a couple of things, so that's why I've kind of covered it specifically. Also, speaking of G6, yeah, there's also like the Tiger spot, which, yeah, you're not going to see it all that much, but I do like briefly touch on like what the differences are if they play H6 first h5, so you can kind of see some of the drawbacks from black's point of view, as well as like the surface level stuff. And okay, the Scandinavian, it's sort of like its own separate structure, but I kind of talk about it in relation to some other systems like Caro-Kann and Rubinstein French, where it sort of comes up a bit more. And then finally, I have also done one section on side of this Alakin structure, which again, it's very, very specific, but I think it's just kind of good to know like these structures just to really give as close to a complete picture as possible, so that whatever line you can play against, you can kind of relate it to a structure you've seen before. And I do appreciate, yeah, it took quite a while to cover this. And, this video, I said, that I didn't want it to be a 2 hour video, but it probably is going to be a 2 hour video with the level of depth we'll go into. But I do think that this was really valuable to kind of understand, okay, these are the actually listing what the different structures are first, and then seeing how they arise, so you can really appreciate why it's important to know how to play them. And also means that, for example, if there are certain structures that you really want to kind of emphasize, you'll sort of know like roughly where to look at them in the video, so you can kind of, find the ones that might relate the most to your particular repertoire as such. So, for example, you play Caro-Kann against E4, you can kind of like go right there if you want to really kind of do an 80-20, like focusing on the 20% of the video that will give you the 80% of the results in the short term. Anyway, with that being said, let's now actually talk a little bit about some of the structures. And you'll notice here I'm doing it a little bit differently, like rather than using full games, which would be a very long series, and something I might do in the future, like if you do want me to cover like this topic of pawn structures more deeply, say in a course or in a coaching program, then do let me know in the comments below. And it's something that, if there's enough demand, I would be happy to create it. But basically, for this first structure, I'm just going to be looking purely at the pawns, because as Filidor said, the pawns are the soul of chess. And something you'll often notice with this structure is it often arises where the black knight is stuck on a5, and it's going to have a very hard time getting back into the game. Like, you can't go to c6, obviously, but even if you maneuver like this, the knight's still not that active on f7. Same story if you go knight c4, b3, you're often just going to be dominated by a pawn on b3 like that. In terms of white's plans, white's often going to be playing moves like a4 and just kind of keeping this tension against the pawn and just steadily building up the pressure. Because the thing is, like, you've got this long-term space advantage, as I kind of mentioned earlier in the video, where you don't really need to do a whole lot. You can kind of just rely on the long-term advantage to steadily squeeze the opponent. There's something that I remember used to be called the Spanish torture, actually, by the old Soviet chess masters. And if you look at black's sort of pawn breaks, it's kind of hard for black to find a great pawn break because f5. I'm going to use different color arrows just so it's a little bit clearer. But if you say play f5, you'll kind of see that when those pawns get traded, you're just going to get a really nice outpost on e4 for the knight. It's kind of hard for black to really deal with it. And if they play g6 and f5 to try to take back with the pawn like in a King's Indian, well, then a lot of times your king is just going to be way too exposed because that bishop kind of pointing in the direction of the king on c2. And as far as white's plans go, like, you're not always going to be able to win the battle on the queen side, but you're often going to be able to use that principle of two weaknesses, kind of like an elastic band that stretches so far until it can't stretch any further, as you're kind of seeing with my arms right now. So if they're tied up on the queen side, the piece right there, then you can kind of switch then to an attack on the king side, which it can take some different forms, but usually it's going to involve f4 at some point. So that's sort of breaking ideas from white. From black's point of view, kind of their dream would be that if they can get in the move c4 after white's played a4, like in a Brea, well, then it means you get this really nice square in c5 for the knight, where you're not worried about b4 attacking that knight or getting a permanent space range. You can just take on son and open the queen side in your favor. So it's kind of sort of the better version for black. You'll often see in the Brea lines, like with a4 and move 15, for example. And like I said, yeah, there are some versions where you might want to try to play f5, but a lot of the time it's just not going to work for tactical reasons. So it usually requires white to sort of misplay it quite badly before that works. But if white has like a knight on g3, then sometimes we'll have ideas of like h5, h4, where you can sort of grab space that way and play it more strategically. Sometimes you can also try to trade off your dark squared bishop because that's kind of your bad piece in these positions. So yeah, those are kind of some of the ideas you can sort of work with. Like, obviously, going into it this way, like, it's not going to be the same depth as going through like a lot of like model games. Like, that would really be the step four of like having true sort of GM level understanding. But the great thing about approaching it this way is that it really gives you foundations where you can see the ideas a lot more clearly because of the fact that there aren't any pieces on the board. And I probably should also mention, well, like a general point about these space advantage positions is that if white has all the minor pieces on the board, black will struggle to find good squares for their pieces. But if some of the minor pieces get traded, then black can really start to basically find free room for their piece, like all their pieces will find good squares, and black will start to get really good counterplay in a lot of cases. So yeah, that's sort of the breakdown. And I would also encourage you, like I know I mentioned this before, but it sort of bears repeating that with these times, like I really would encourage you to try out some of these ideas in your own games. Like if say it's a system where like you want to practice structure and you're not sure how often you'll get in your own games, like you can just play it against a computer or play it against a friend or training partner, and then you can like practice those structures and really sort of get that feedback you need because no matter how many games you play from a given structure, it's only when or no matter how many games you study, I should say, from a given structure, the true mastery is going to come from kind of your own experience and really applying those ideas yourself. And yeah, you can certainly, once you've played a game, like look at some similar games in the database on top of it to really kind of understand how the positions play out at a master and grandmaster level. But yeah, you do need to have some experience in the positions before you can truly call yourself a master of them. It's just part of the journey. But I do think, yeah, this coverage will make that journey so much easier for you. Because also what will happen is when you're looking at those model games or looking at those grandmaster games of structure, you'll see, oh yeah, I remember this idea that Max showed me, and you'll kind of be able to see, okay, this is when like A4 works, and this is when A4 doesn't work so well, and just kind of draw your own lessons and conclusions from that. So I just want to kind of explain that just so that you don't just come out of this with a better understanding, but you have the power to really improve your understanding of your own accord, without relying on, say, the next video before you get that next boosting and understanding. I really believe in the importance of independent learning. Well, in anything, but especially in chess. Now, for this structure, I actually have included the material imbalance because I do think that the material imbalance does play a significant aspect of how these structures play out. Because obviously, if it was a pawn endgame, white would just be a pawn up. They just create a passed pawn eventually and just win the game because black can't do the same with their crippled majority. Like if you just put your pawns like this, they're just never going to get through. But that's where having the bishop pair comes in handy. Because let's say if you try to put all the pawns on the light squares to negate their bishop, which is definitely a thing. Well, with that unopposed bishop, well, they can try to, get in from behind. They could try to open up the position. So you can sort of see like black is able to actually use that majority a lot more effectively when it's supported by the bishop pair. And obviously, if we were able to just take those dark square bishops off the board, well, then we just put our pawns on light squares and their bishop would just be very stuck because they don't have a dark square bishop to take those light squares that were left, to take those dark squares that were left behind. So, and in terms of white's plans, yeah, like it might seem natural to try to create a passed pawn, but if you play f4 too early, what will happen is e4 will often be a bit of a weakness. And that's sort of the reason why you'll usually see white play moves like f3 instead. Just kind of put the pawns on the opposite color complex to remaining bishop. This is a very well-known Capablanca's principle. And from there, just kind of build up steadily, like put the pieces on good squares. Like you do have an open file, so you're not as reliant on a pawn break. And like I said, black's going to be playing more to get queen side majority rolling and grabbing space and potentially turn into weaknesses that you can attack later. If you can fix those queen side pawns in place, it definitely makes it easier. You'll sort of see black sometimes try for a more strategy just restraining white's majority, but there are also some lines you can play more dynamically. Go f5, try to open up the position for your bishops. Something like this would be just I don't know why it's asking me to. Yeah, some of the pawn should teleport over to queen like that, like it's like ChatGPT in the old days. But you can sort of see the point here, like even though it's the kings are off the board, you can kind of see how white's not able to defend that pawn on c2 with the pin and such. So that's kind of a nice demonstration of some typical ideas, and that will definitely get you started with feeling comfortable in these sort of positions. And I know it's a lot of arrows, but I mean, you can always like rewatch this part and I'll help you to consolidate it. Or another thing you can also do to really make it super learning is to take like this position, without most of the arrows, like just put it on the board without the arrows, even a physical board if you really want to. And you can try like see how much of you remembered, because then the parts you missed, you'll have that retrieval memory where you'll just retain it so much more strongly if you test yourself, especially in a space kind of way. But let's move on to the next one. So this is a symmetrical structure that you can get in a lot of different versions, like in the some of the versions, like the Berlin Rookie one line, like sometimes the pawn is stuck and it takes a little bit of an effort before you actually get the pawn on d5. But sort of in this case, like one of the main ways that they'll sort of determine who gets initiative in a structure like this is often going to be who can sort of get and keep an eye on e5 versus black getting an eye on e4 first. Because often in times like their knight will be stuck on f3 or like our knight will be stuck on f3 or their knight will be stuck on f6 if you look at it from white's perspective. So it's going to be hard for them to kick away our knights. And even if they do, sometimes it's just going to weaken their king a little bit too much in the long term. Again, it depends on the position. But you also have some other dynamic ideas where you can try to go c4 and try to unbalance the structure. Where if they trade, you end up getting like that isolating queen to pawn structure that we'll see a bit later. Obviously, the same concept can apply from black's point of view as well. That if white tries to attack on the king side, we know some ideas like this sort of thing. They can try to meet that with a counter attack in the center as per the classic principles. And also a lot of cases I find that if you're really stuck and you're not really sure how to make progress, like a very nice idea and one I'll probably include in my Grandmaster playbook in the future is this idea of using the rook's pawns to create chances. And okay, I mean, white could also use the eighth pawn, black could also use the eighth pawn. I'm just showing it on opposite sides, so it's not like, too much of a kaleidoscope of color confusion. But that's sort of the idea. Like, if you're able to get that pawn to h6, well, either you weaken their structure, or they play g6, and you might have some mating ideas of queen f6 takes g7 mate later in the game. Or conversely, like, say, if they meet, and it's like very loosely speaking, let's just say that they meet h5 of h6. Yeah, some of my pawn teleported, but even if you take a situation like this one, um, yeah, it's not really showing it so clearly, so I'll just use the. It's kind of because I have like a legal move set. That's probably what's causing the problem. But basically, what I'm trying to show that even if they play h6, that still you've managed to kind of make their structure less flexible. Where if they can't move the h pawn anymore, if they move the g pawn, you can take and weaken them a bit. If they move the f pawn, well now g6 as a whole. So you're just really limiting the opponent's options, and those are the kind of little things that can give you the edge in a position that might otherwise be close to equal or where it doesn't feel like a whole lot is happening. So hopefully that gives you some ideas to kind of work with as such. You probably don't tend to see like ideas of preparing c4 with the pawn, but I'll mention it just in case it comes up like for the 2% case where it might be relevant. Actually, one thing I will mention before moving on is like there is also the version of the structure where they play c6, and it obviously is very situational, but I do think it's generally better to kind of keep that pressure on the pawn and keep the tension rather than playing a move like c5. Again, it depends, but often what will happen is they can kind of put pressure on d4. They kind of have this very solid structures pointing at your king, so you have to be a little bit careful with when you play c5 because sometimes the minority, sometimes the queen's attack's not going to be worth it for the pressure that you give up on their center. And obviously this structure, yeah, is obviously quite a symmetrical one where like not a whole lot is happening. But again, if you can kind of get your knight on e5 or maybe get like a good knight versus bad bishop sort of position, there's some ways which you can kind of try to outplay your opponent or, if you have more pressure on their pawn than they do on yours, that can also give you a bit of an edge. But okay, that's getting a little bit deep into the weeds, but I did want to make sure that I did justice to the structure rather than, doing just a superficial coverage of it. But yeah, moving on to actually one further I will mention as well is like if they move their bishop, some people have ideas like queen b3 to attack their pawn. Like there's one little tactical trick you do want to look out for. But with that, let's move on to some other ones like the IQP against C-Pawn, which ties in very well actually because I just mentioned before how like if you play C4, they take and you take back that you can get this structure. So it's kind of perfect timing in a way. But basically, the thing to realize is that you've basically bartered having inferior, worse pawn structure for certain dynamic advantages, like having an advantage in space because you're the only one with pawn in the center. You also that then gives you good attacking chances where often your knight can come to e5. If the play's more slower, every now and then you'll see the knight come to c5, but it's a bit of a rare idea. Your bishop on c4, d3 is pointing towards their king, which is really nice. often your bishop will just be on an active square like g5. Sometimes you can try to swing the rook in the attack. Because it's a more open position, that's why I don't really use the pawns quite as much. It's more about playing actively with the pieces. And I think if you really embody that and look for those tactical tricks, especially, that's kind of the lens that will really help you. Like these sort of pawn moves like b4, b5, you just don't really see it a whole lot in these kind of positions. But something like h4, h5, h6, it's a very situational idea, but it can be useful if you do have that very much stability of the center and they can't really like change the trajectory of the game in a sense. Whereas from Black's point of view, and I'll kind of put a move on the board just to kind of make it a little bit clearer, but basically Black's first goal is to cover the d5 square, because one of White's main breakthroughs is to go d5 and release the latent energy of their pieces. Like that's really kind of the main pawn break for White. So Black really wants to cover this square, like blockade with an idol, just control it with the pieces, and that will allow them, just to not be worried about the pawn moving forward. And also does help a little bit to neutralize some of the attacking ideas I mentioned just beforehand. In terms of Black's dream in his structure, basically Black really wants to exchange off the minor pieces specifically. And the reason for that is, first of all, the minor pieces are kind of the better attackers to go after the king. But also another aspect of it is that, say if you visualize a position, I'll just make a pass move white just to make it clearer. But let's just visualize a position where all of the major pieces are lined up. We've got Alakin's gun, with the queen on d8 behind the rooks. And let's say white just has the piece where, like, let's say just say have the same thing just to make it easier. Well, in this case, what you could do is you could play a move like rook to d5. Let's just say the kings are here for argument's sake. And then they make some move, like let's say they play a3 and we've got our rook on d5. Then we just use the pin to play c5. So we play rook d5 so they can't play d5 and push forward. And they can't take us because then they're going to lose the rook if you start that visual of the rooks all and queens all in position. Meaning that they're just going to end up losing the pawn, and when you're up a pawn, you're probably going to win, especially when their pieces are so passive. So that's kind of the breakdown of how you actually win from these positions is when facing the IQP. You block their IQP, you make sure you don't get mated, basically. And a good way to do it is to exchange off their minor pieces. Exchange off the queens is also not bad, actually, for what it's worth. And then from there, you basically line up your rooks against their rooks, play c5 and win the pawn. That's pretty much the blueprint. And the same thing also works like if you have the e-pawn, we'll kind of see that a bit later as well. But yeah, that's pretty much the breakdown of what both sides are aiming for. And I think it was good to go deeper into the IQP specifically because it does arise from a lot of different versions and a lot of different openings. So it's definitely one you need to know to be a chess master. But yeah, for this here, this is kind of structure that you will see from kind of the Steinitz Scheveningen view. You'll sometimes get from some royal pairs or Italians where like you have the center and they go d5, you meet with e5, it's a way you can get it. So white obviously has more space, and like if it was just a position in isolation, like white would just be doing very well, where they could just go for a pawn storm and just make the black king in a certain sense. Like even the two pawns side by side with e5 and f5 are very strong here. If we put them on the board just to kind of show you what I mean, this is sort of the dream for white. But black usually does have some compensating factors that, for example, they could play c5 and try to undermine the center, and if those pawns get traded, then that structure can still be very good for white, to be fair, if the e5 pawn is well supported, like with f4 or with like the piece like knight f3, bishop f4, bishop d3, this sort of thing. But if the pawn's not so well defended, then yeah, you can actually really undermine it and have quite a good position. Also, it's a lot rarer, like it's very rare that you'll play c4 and just let them dominate the center. Usually you do want to keep that tension between the pawns a bit longer. You also will sometimes see f6, like it really depends on the position. Like sometimes it's just going to be too weakening and weakening your king, like usually you want to take back a piece on f6 and get this kind of structure like that f file and e file gives you good counterplay on the king side, just with the piece play. Whereas white maybe struggles a little bit to find good pawn break. It's going to be more about the piece play for white in a structure like this. I wonder if I can do a magic trick. Yeah, I can move the pawn back. I actually didn't know I could do that. That's actually a really cool feature in chess space. Going to make more use of moving forward. But basically, yeah, you can kind of see how, yeah, again, it's more about sort of the piece play in a situation like this. And yeah, there might be some minority attack ideas that come up, but again, it's very situational. As unit comes up more, you already have control of the position. But yeah, that's a little bit of a breakdown of the structure. I'll spend a bit less time on it because it doesn't come up quite as much, but that's just the basic ideas. Now, this Italian one can actually have a lot of different ways that it plays out. And when you're looking just at the pawn structure, you might be thinking, well, f4 looks quite tempting to attack the pawn that way, or your f5 to go for this. But the thing is, normally the knights are on f3 and f6. You don't tend to see those ideas so much. Because you want to play f4, you probably have the knight on c3, not the pawn, right? And I will admit the King's Gambit sort of type structures are a little bit of a gap in this coverage just because you have to pick and choose at some point. But basically, yeah, this f5 is an idea that you will see every now and then, but often it takes so much time to prepare it, it's just not really worth it in a way. Like white will take, play d4, and just kind of have the initiative with their lead in development in the center. So the plans tend to revolve more around a bit of a race. It basically becomes, I'm just going to play h6 just so we kind of remove the arrows. But it basically becomes a race of can white get in d4 before black gets in d5. And regarding the d5 structure, we'll kind of see how that plays out like later on, like sort of seeing this kind of structure. So we will be covering that next up. But to focus on a little bit more from White's point of view, basically, and I'm just kind of playing some typical pawn moves that you'll often see in these lines. Like often you'll see Black play a6 to make that hidey hole for the bishop for when we play d4. Sometimes you'll see a5. There were some similar ideas saying they can also try to expand on the queen side and just get that bit extra space. Maybe take away our plans of like queen side expansion, which is kind of our plan B if d4 is not working for some reason. Also, to worth pointing out, there are some cases where you can also play with the pieces. Like you can, do your standard Lopez maneuver, put an eye on f5, and try to attack on the king side. That is an idea you will sometimes see. G4, G5 definitely is a bit more exceptional. Usually, you are going to attack a bit more with the pieces. Like it tends to work quite well when they play d5, for example, and you've just got those pawns side by side in the center. Where sort of your piece that kind of makes up for their space. But really, the dream is to get in the move of d4 as white. And it's worth pointing out this isn't just for the Italian, but also for the Royal Intense. If you get in this structure, you're just doing very well because if black keeps attention, well, we can just kind of develop behind those pawns and just have a very solid position. Something like this could be a possible demonstration. This is very loosely speaking, like usually the tension will resolve before you get all these moves in, but just to kind of show you like where the pieces might typically go as white, like rooks on c1, e1, knights on g3, f3, etc. But also if black does take, yeah, you just kind of get this full control of the center. To make this work, like you usually need some very fast counter to really justify giving up the center like this. But if you just get to keep the center, I mean, you'll often just sit on the position and just build up, like I said. There will be certain versions where you could try to like make d5 work tactically or transition into a kind of King's Indian type structure. But again, it's going to be very situational. Like it's going to depend so much on the position it's hard to, and where the piece are, it's going to be hard to give like a lot of generalities on that. But it is quite an important structure, and I hope that with these ideas you can really feel a lot more confident knowing like, okay, what is white actually aiming for in this, and what also is black aiming for in these kind of positions. And again, you could also make a similar comment that the c5 move like it's quite a nice one to hold back the move of d4, and so playing the Scheveningen kind of style with some queenside counterplay. But again, that's going to be a lot more situational as it were. So, I mean, it does up some d3 royal pairs lines, I suppose, but not as much in the Italian. Anyway, with that, let's move on to our next structure, the one with like d5 and takes. And yeah, definitely on paper, black is doing very well with the extra space. But what will often happen is white will have a lead in development where they can just attack the pawn with pieces. Often you'll see that knight come to e4 as well. And another idea you'll often have is that in many cases you'll be able to go for an attack on the king and just point the piece in that direction. Say moves like knight h4, maybe using the g5 square if they didn't play h6. Just use different colors so you can kind of see it. Let's just say I put the move h6 on the board just to make the point clear. Well, you could definitely see a kind of light squared strategy forming potentially where you just put the knights on e4, f5, and just really build up an attack on the king. Like you might have some bishop h6 sacs and subversions. And black's just going to be playing more stabilized. Like, for example, one of the more advanced Soviet preempts is to put the bishop back on f8 rather than a7. because that really helps defend against a lot of the attacking ideas I've just mentioned. But again, a lot of it's going to really depend on the position. Like the trade of minor pieces obviously is going to reduce the space disadvantage for white, but it also might take away some of those initiative ideas I've mentioned. And the one other trick you also kind of want to look out for is there'll be some position where you can play d4 for tactical reasons. Like if you can trade off these pawns, it's just going to solve all your problems. And sometimes even give you a nice initiative. Like there are some tricks where sometimes they can't take on d4 because they end up like losing the knight on d5 to a tactic. So yeah, there's things like that you can sort of watch out for in these positions. And yeah, usually the pawns will get exchanged. You'll get that wide open center that we'll see a little bit later, which again is a little bit more based around piece play than pawn play. So with that, moving on to this, yeah, we already kind of talked about this structure. I kind of included it as a separate one just to kind of make sure that we addressed it. Then I suppose one thing I didn't cover so much is like what if they play c6? Because compared to a Filidor structure, like we've got the pawn on c3 rather than a knight on c3, which definitely makes things a lot more flexible. And the thing is that when you have a long-term advantage, you can just basically be patient to build up, as I was sort of saying before. You don't have to like go for some crazy pawn storm or, the playing on the queens are probably a bit less committal by comparison, but you also can kind of just centralize, just build up the piece in the center and kind of wait for the right moment to expand, like whether that's with c4, whether that's with b4, a4, a5. But there will also be some cases where you might get some attacking chance on the king side. But that being said, you have to be a little bit careful. Like when you play knight h4, it might open the door for some tactics. Like if black can get in d5, that will often allow him again to liquidate the center and equalize. So that's kind of the main thing you have to watch out for here as white. And also how black can try to equalize by contrast. With that, let's move on to this wide open center. I've already kind of referenced it a few times. Like it really is just about piece play. One thing you do have to watch out for sometimes that pawn on C7 can be a little bit weak. Like it's very situational, but just something to kind of keep in mind that that's going to be usually the weakest point when like F7 is covered so well. In terms of how white will attack, like usually it's going to be like a bishop on D3. I guess often you'll have like H3, H6 in by the time bishop H7 becomes any sort of threat. Like it just doesn't usually work as well when they can cover H7 with the bishop, for example. Like after you do the Greek gift sack and everything. But there are some ideas where you could definitely try to get like a knight to f5 or black can try to get a knight to f4. Like those are often going to be the ways you create chances. And like I've said before, in these symmetrical structures, like this is a tip you might want to write down if you've got like some sort of note taker handy, but often the way you will create chances will be by using the rook's pawns to create weaknesses because without any real weaknesses in the opponent's camp, it's just going to be very hard to really convert it into a win. Like your advantage is going to be so infinitesimal. But if you're able to create some weaknesses and have some mating ideas or back rank mates or stuff, so maybe one day you can like win this pawn or clean your pawn. That's going to be the way in which you'll be able to create winning chances if the piece play isn't really completely having the desired effect, let's say. So you might already get a kind of notice, there are a lot of sort of overlap between some different ideas. And with this sort of Scotch Gambit kind of structure, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it basically boils down to if you're able to blockade these squares, like let's just say black doesn't play very well and we just are able to get this blockade, like that's pretty much the dream for white where they can't get their pawns moving as they would like. And then we just have open slab and just go f4, f5 and basically make their king at some point in the future. You don't really see that much pawn play on the queen side, like moves like c4 just sort of tend to kind of help black open the position for the bishop. So there'll definitely be a couple of situations where it makes sense, but is a little bit more the exception. And like I said before, black's idea is going to be more to because often in these lines, the knight is actually going to be on d4. So that's sort of black's idea is they want to kind of get the pawns like this and really get their unopposed like square bishop active. Sometimes you'll also see black fight back as well on the king side, just not giving white a free ride there. And also we'll sometimes see white play moves like c3 to try to stop d4, but if you're playing that, usually it's more to play for equality than for an advantage. So those are a few basic ideas to get you started. I know this is a little surface level, but I think these ideas will probably be enough to allow you to outplay like almost anyone below 200 from my coaching experience. And with that, that allows us to move into the Sicilian structures. I know we spend a lot of time on e4, e5, but those really are the most fundamental structures in chess. And if you kind of understand them, you can sort of relate them to a lot of different other openings, essentially. Now, this one here is an example of the Najdorf structure, and Yeah, to be fair, I probably should have flicked the move a6 in just to make the connection a bit more obvious, because this version it would be more like Boleslavsky hold, where you've got the hole on d5. And I mean, that's something you might be wondering here, like, why is it that Black would voluntarily enter this structure when White just have a knight sitting pretty on d5 in theory, especially if you manage to trade off that knight for your dark squared bishop, and then your knight just dominates their bishop, just like in, say, the Smyslov-Rudakovsky game, for example. But basically, what's happening is Black is sort of trading in one disadvantage for another. Like, say if we imagine the pawns on e7, I realize I didn't really cover the pawn on e7 as a specific structure because it just doesn't really stay there very long unless unless you play the move pawn g6, which is something we'll get into a bit later, those dragon structures. But sort of White's advantage with the open Sicilian is kind of twofold. First, that they do have, the lead-in development from, Black having played a non-developed move in pawn c5 earlier. But they also have a space advantage in the center. So you can definitely think of it like bartering, that basically you're trading one disadvantage for another. Where, yeah, you have this whole on d5 that White could try to leverage, but you don't have a space disadvantage anymore. You've got equal space to White, and Black's dream is to be able to get in a move like d5 and take the take over the center, basically. So, for example, let me see if I can just play a random move. Like Black's dream is, I'll also show a bit later, is basically get in d5, trade off the pawns. Try to figure out if there's a way I can take my own pawn. Yeah, found a way to take my own pawn, like in Kramnik chess. But yeah, basically, I think Kramnik chess might be known casting chess actually. But looking at this structure, you can kind of see how Black's the only one with a pawn in the center. I know we'll be covering the structure in a bit more detail a bit later, but it's just to tell you that this is a dream structure for Black that, to be fair, you're usually not going to get it in so quickly just because I have like a heck of a lot of piece covering, like knight on c3, queen on d1. If White goes for an English attack with something like f3, well, then you're also going to have like the queen and the rook covering as well as the knight. Now, normally Black has a bishop on e6, and normally bishop c4 is not such a problem, but there are versions where White gets it in, so again, it makes it hard to get d5 in. So if you're wondering, well, where exactly does White's counterplay sort of come from here? Where Black's counterplay comes from, rather. It basically comes from the queen side, partly. That with b5, you get that space, you make their structure a bit less flexible. Sometimes you can even go for a minority attack much later if White misplays it a bit. We kind of can open some lines and say that c3 might be a little bit of a weakness. Also, another point as well is that this applies a lot more into Kalashnikov, but there are some versions where you can also play f5. Like in the Najdorf, your knight's usually stuck on f6 to cover a d5, so it doesn't apply as much. But certainly if we imagine a structure where those pawns get traded, you can kind of see how you get some active piece play to make up for your hanging pawns in the center. In fact, this structure actually kind of is very similar to the French defense structure we kind of saw before, but they're the pawns on e6 and d5. So yeah, there are some differences. You can kind of see a little bit of the parallels as such. And obviously, if we can fix that structure, that would be very nice as White. So, Blacks are very relying on their active piece play, not their structure in a version like this. Anyway, I think those are sort of the main ideas I want to share. Like, from White's point of view, your main plans are basically to, like I sort of said before, sort of go for the pawn storm against their king. You're often quite happy actually if they play a move like h6, because even if g5 takes longer, it'll give you that hook to kind of open up the king side. You usually don't get in c4 so easily in this version. We'll kind of cover it a little bit later, but often your knight's stuck on c3 and you can't really move it out of the way so easily because either your e4 pawn's under pressure or like they can just trade off your knight. You just can't really leverage the d5 square so directly. If let's say actually you do have, let's say if I go back to this position, like let's say you do play knight d5 and they take it. There are some cases where you take with the pawn, and we will see this structure a little bit later, just so you know how those transformations kind of apply. But the one other main idea is to play f4, which you don't really see as much these days because this kind of structure is one where even though it looks like you have a better structure in theory, it often turns out their e5 outpost makes up for the d5 one. They just get really good counterplay against your e4 pawn, and Black just generally doesn't have too many problems in these kind of structures, especially in the versions where both sides pass it short. So that's just so you kind of see, yeah, that's sort of why he's playing a little bit more with the pieces of the pawns, with probably the notable exception of the English attack pawn storm version. I do also want to mention like a4 is another plan you will often see trying to hold back the move of b5. And if you are able to get a move like a5 and fix that structure, that can be a way to just limit the opponent's flexibility and just kind of outplay them on a sort of maneuvering sort of level. So that's also an idea that's worth knowing before we move on. But the Najdorf is definitely one of the most common pawn structures in chess, and that's why I think it was good to go a bit deeper than usual into it. Now, as for the Scheveningen structure, there's like so many different versions you can get that, we won't be able to fully do justice to it, but basically it boils down to a few different plans where like the one that I think is the most promising in theory for white is the one where you can get in G4, G5, H4, H5 and just basically make their king or when they castle short. And what's interesting is this plan actually can often work very well even when they don't castle short, because they're still succeeding in kind of opening up lines to their king and just weakening, say, the E6 pawn, for example, when you attack I guess it's not a pawn chain, when you attack the pawn structure at its base, as it were. And it's also not that easy for black to avoid the opening position when you have like one pawn attacking two pawns, just as a general principle. It's a nice way to force open the lines in your favor. So what can black do about this plan? Also, I will add before moving on, there are other versions where you can play f4 and then kind of go for like an e5 break and try to take the initiative that way, playing a little bit more with the pieces, as it were. But I'm probably going to talk about that a little bit more in the card section because I feel like it fits a little bit better there, like a6, a4 thrown in, just so we don't kind of bite off too much at once. But in terms of how black can get compensation for like white's attacking ideas, I will admit that from an engine point of view, like on a base level, the structure is a little bit better for white. And so these counterplay ideas I mentioned, they won't always be completely sufficient. But the obvious one again is to, get in b5 and have that queenside counterplay. If they play f4, you kind of have some pressure against e4. And if they play f3, there is actually this kind of modern idea that you sort of see where you can actually play h5 and try to hold back g4. And honestly, it's one I probably should have mentioned the e5 structure because it actually probably comes up even more there than it does in the e6 version. But it's a good idea to know to kind of hold back that kingside attack where, yeah, your king is stuck in the center, but if white doesn't have a good pawn break, it can be a little bit hard to exploit that. Because a move like f4 would take an extra tempo now, for example. And h5 is like not a useless move in that version either. Something you also have to watch out for is that there are some versions where b5 will be a bit premature if white can go a4 and kind of just sort of attack the queen side before black's ready to defend it. Because, for example, say if you get this structure and the pawns get traded, well, then the pawn a6 is a weakness that we can attack, and it also makes our knight very stable so that, black can't get in their dream pawn break of d5 like we talked about in the e5 version. And it applies here as well. Like, if black can trade the d pawn for the e pawn, then it's going to be doing very well in that queenside majority structure. But the problem is that often you can meet d5 with e5 and just get a really good French where because black kind of lost tempo playing d5 and because their pieces just often aren't very well placed for a French structure, that odd transition will often be very good for white, just so you know. The one other idea I will mention before moving on is you will often see black play some moves like e5 as well, where even though it loses tempo, it's kind of a way to again transition that sort of good Najdorf structure that I mentioned at the end of the previous structure. So just kind of making a few of those connections clear before we move on to the next type of structure. And this Rauzer one, it's a very, very specific one, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it's only going to be relevant for a small minority. But basically, the idea is that black will have the bishop pair to compensate for this typically, because you normally go bishop f6, gf6. And so with that in mind, like black sort of saying that, okay, my structure's not the best, but it's kind of hard for white to force open the position in their favor, because when they do, well, it's going to undouble the pawns or usually we kind of see white play f5 and kind of use their extra light squared piece to put pressure on the. I mean, obviously, we might not be able to play bishop b3, but you might put the bishop on h3 instead to target the pawn that way. And you're going to sort of try to put a much pressure on e6 so that kind of you provoke them into playing e5, and then you can kind of use that d5 square. Now, to be fair, black does have some ways to get counterplay, like it's not completely one-way traffic, but it is typically thought that these sort of structures are going to be a little bit better for white, just kind of like an improved special of where you got the pawn on f5 instead of f2, so you get their usual special counterplay that we'll see a bit later, just to make that connection clear. And also there will be some versions where you can even like play fe6, like even though it looks like a strategic mistake. If you've got lead in development and you sort of have a good tactical follow-up to exploit their king in the center, that can be a really nice way to take advantage of that. And that's sort of one reason why you will often see like castle long. Maybe often isn't the right word. Like you tend to see it more when the pawn's on b7. Then you might see that kind of come into play a little bit more because your king's a little bit safer in the long term, and you're not worried about like rook lifts quite as much there. But then those are just some ideas you can kind of work with. That a lot of it is about you find the ways to put pressure on the light squares as white, whereas black's going to try to leverage the long-term advantage of bishop pair and solidity. And there will be some case of late middle game where sometimes you can go d5 to break through and make it work, but it is very situational. So it's more something to kind of keep an eye out for than for like the main idea. But it would be nice, of course, if you can get it in. With that, let's move on to. So this is a dragon structure where I think if I hadn't shown you the move order earlier, actually, to be fair, this is a version with the pawn f3. That is kind of an important addition, to be fair. But if I had shown you earlier move order of like castles and this sort of thing, you probably wouldn't make the connection so clearly. But the opposite side castling, even though it normally would make the position a lot more dynamic, it is a position that is, I think, quite stable for white. Where it just as a general tip, the exchange of pieces is usually going to be quite nice for white because it kind of makes it easier for you to like blockade, like say put a knight on c5 without worrying about their bishop on g7, for example. Okay, usually it does end up getting traded with bishop d4, so that is sort of a reason why you're not as worried about the attack down the b file because they don't have the bishop to really back it up in this particular version. But also, it's also true that if you have like just a rook endgame, a rook endgame is going to be really nice for white. You can kind of just swing the rook over, like rook a4, rook a6, just really tie black to defense with the pawns, which is definitely quite nice. If it's a middle game, my main attack idea is going to be to try to go h4 and try to open up that h file in your favor. Sometimes you can also go h6 and use a pawn, kind of like I've mentioned a couple of times in some other versions. And black tries to stop that with h4, h5. Actually, I'll show it visually because it's kind of, I think, easier to remember if I actually kind of show the visual rather than like just using the arrows. So just kind of showing it on the board so you can kind of see what it means. Obviously, they play FG6. Yeah, that's going to leave them with yet another pawn island. So not really so nice with like from a strategic point of view. But if they play H5 to stop that, I mean, it kind of makes sense that you could go G4 and you've got that hook to open up the king side in your favor. So there's just kind of a few ideas to sort of work with. And if they have the pawn on E5, we'll kind of touch on that in the next one, because I believe that does. Okay, actually, I didn't cover it as a separate game, so I will touch on it here. So usually there you have your bishop just sitting on C5, just backed up by the knights, and even though black does have the bishop, it can theoretically, open up with E4 and give black some good play down the E there, down the long diagonal, attacking B2. I find that when black does equalize, his position usually is from getting in the move E4 at a good moment. The thing is, it's not always so easy to get it in, because white kind of has this easy plan of just expanding on the king side. So if you do play f5, which kind of open up the king side and say your king is just very weak. But if you don't, you also just don't really have a good pawn break. And you can even just like keep the tension as white. You could also, again, go for the pawn of h6. To be fair, you usually don't see it as often here, either because black played h6 themselves or, hg6 or Kiwi10 just kind of work better. But at least it's good to know what your options are for kind of converting your strategic advantage into a win. Because at the end of the day, black does have one more pawn island, and they do have to play very precisely in order to really kind of make up for this. Like the central space doesn't really matter as much as you might think in these sorts of positions. And that tends to be especially more true, as some of the pieces get traded. Though I will say that there are certain trades that do kind of help black, but I don't want to go too deep into the weeds because there's a bit of a rare structure. With that, let's move on to this one, which, I mean, generally, this is just a very nice structure for white in the long term because you're not worried about d5, you're not really worried about b5. And so black just really struggles to find a good pawn break. And if there's sort of one insight that you really, I think, can take away and apply just across the board, not just in one structure, it's this idea that in closed sided positions without a pawn break, you just don't really have a plan, generally speaking. Now, it is true that black does have this idea of f5 that will kind of be black's main source of counterplay. If that's on around f6, it's kind of hard to get in because when the knight moves, you just take the square that's left behind. But f5 is going to be that main source of counterplay where, we've already talked a little bit about these kind of structures a bit earlier. They can try to play fe4, but again, you can take with the knights and or the bishop and just have that nice pressure on d6. You don't really tend to see f4 be that much of a thing because The difference with the King's Indian is that you just have this pressure down the D file and an easy way to open it up. And for that reason, the pawn storm on the flank just doesn't really have anywhere near the same strength to it. So this is basically to say this is just a very nice position for white structurally. You don't even necessarily need to do anything crazy. Like you kind of just build up, like put your pieces on like natural squares, like maybe your knight comes to e3 and d5 or something. And in terms of pawn break, yeah, you're kind of just like if they play b6, so you can maybe go a4, a5 and create an additional weakness. Maybe you're looking for the right time to play c5 and sort of use your extra space and the more active piece placement given you to take the initiative. That being said, a lot of times c5 will also just kind of eliminate your advantage by sort of, taking away your space advantage. So you do want to be very careful with the time. It's like you really want to do if the tactics really work for you. But you can just build up steadily, kind of let them sort of stew in their own juices, and that will often be the way to make the most of your space advantage. And obviously the more minor pieces you can keep on the board, the better, generally speaking. The sort of exception being like sometimes if you trade your bishop for their knight to really dominate d5, like sometimes that can be a thing, but a lot of the times your grip on d5 is so strong that you don't even need to trade off their knight for a bishop. You could just trade it for a knight and it would work just as well. And obviously the structure also could transform into like an improved King's Indian structure with cd5 as well as taking with a piece. So you've got options to kind of increase your advantage from here. But that's sort of why you don't really see this so much at a high level. And if this does work with black, it will often be connected to trying to get some counterplay on the queen side. But even then, white's usually still going to be a bit better in those kinds of positions, just as a general tip. Okay, moving on to the version with e6. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that this could play out. Like this kind of is an overlap with the hedgehog because normally the way you'll see these structures play out is with something like this happening where like black plays a6. I'm just going to make a random move like b3 here, and black plays b6. So you very often just get a structure like this for black. And what I've kind of observed is that, I've sort of mentioned a lot of times before that you want to trade pieces, especially trading the minor pieces when you have less space. But the hedgehog, to me, is something an interesting exception to that idea, where often if some of those pieces get traded, it kind of eliminates the kind of coil spring black has, where black has ideas of trying to go d5 or b5, those are the main ways in which they will try to free themselves. And of course, if you play precisely as white, they're not really going to get it in successfully, but that's at least what black's dream is. And if they can't get that in, they're usually going to try to create counterplay on the king side, like h5, h4, h3, trying to create some weaknesses around the king. More rarely, you'll see an idea of like the rook on g8, g5, g4, which usually these days white players have like a level of technique where they're not going to let you get it in, but if you can get it in, it will usually be quite an interesting way to create dynamic chances. Sometimes you'll see the bishop sort of swing over to c7, and that can be a way to make d5 work where you discover an attack on the h2 pawn, for example. That's a trick that can definitely catch out a lot of top players unawares. So that's kind of the main ideas from Black's perspective of what you're really trying to do. And also to work out, there is a different version with the pawn on f4, which I'm not going to talk about so much from Black's perspective, because this version just tends to be much better for White, where you just kind of have the bishops just pointing towards their king. You kind of just go like g4, and you basically just make their king is kind of the idea. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot Black can really do about it. Like b5 tends to just be negated. White usually just has too much of a grip on d5 for Black to be able to get it in. Like knight c3, rook d1, maybe bishop c2 to cover it. So it just ends up not really being a playable structure for Black. And I know it's a million arrows, but I think you sort of get the idea of like how the pieces kind of move into the attack. And of course, therefore, you also do have ideas like d5 as well as e5. So you just have so much flexibility the extra space offers you, and that's kind of the reason why I'm going to focus a little bit more on this version of the structure with the pawn on f3, because that is one that some Jews can't have. Like you get it with the pawn f3, not on f4, because they just have a bit too much pressure on the center, and like f4 just you don't really get a good opportunity to get it into the sense. But I find that the plans that really work well here for white basically there's a few different options. Like one of them is to go a4, a5. Let me just make some random moves for black. Like let's just say, yeah, let's just say to go h5 because we did talk about this concept a bit before. How you can create some weaknesses and whichever way they deal with it, their structure gets a bit more loose. But basically, yeah, with this version that we have just here. What's nice about A5 is, again, if you get this sort of structure, it's kind of like an improved version of the Scheveningen structure because our pawns are further ahead. We have more space to work with, meaning that we're fixing their weaknesses in place. And sometimes that can even be applied himself. We just kind of put the bishop on F4 and just put pressure on D6 in this kind of way. Usually black will put an eye on E5 to kind of avoid that, but it is something worth knowing about because it can come up in some situations. Other than that, the main break you're really aiming for is to kind of get into C5 at a good moment, which might seem kind of weird that you're giving away some of your space advantage, but often, like, say, if you have, because often one of the main maneuvers black will be to kind of put their queen on B8, rook on C8. And if you've got like rooks on B1 and C1 and you open it up, you can kind of picture like how you might take knight C5, you open up your rook opposite the queen, you've got this annoying pin on their bishop to the queen. Like you can sort of visualize how that can kind of work tactically on a general sort of level. And also kind of shows some of the value of getting in A5, that it does make it easier to get in C5. You don't have the pawn on B6 to worry about. There are some cases you have to be a little bit careful than playing A5 and sort of getting C5 their knights. So sometimes you do want to be a little bit more patient and you might put the pawn on A3 to make that a bit less of a problem, like make sure the pawn's defended and that there aren't any, discovered attacks against D4 with D5 tactically. But yeah, those are kind of the main ideas you usually work with. And as a general pointer, I would say that in a lot of cases, you're not really going to be wanting to play like, okay, this one's a little bit of an exception. I mentioned G4, G5 is an attacking idea. But I will say as a tip, I usually don't want to kind of burn your bridges too much with this. Because if you move the pawns too far, they'll often be able to kind of open up the center in their favor. And then your weaker king will kind of hurt you a lot in the long term. So just be a bit careful of that. And like, especially in the pawn every, like try to play a bit more with the pieces and with the pawns on like as far as this goes. And yeah, more B4 and like this is going to be more what you're kind of going for as white. Also, there are some cases where you can try to, you can also try to attack the pawn. Like again, knight A4 is a bit of a tactical trick that you can like keep an eye out for it. And if they sort of misplay it, you can sometimes win a pawn like that. Anyway, moving on to the next one. I know I spent a lot of time on the Hedgehog structure, but it's probably one of the structures that confuses more people than nearly anyone else. That's kind of why I want to go deep into it. Yeah, as for the Maroczy structure in, let's say, the Accelerated Dragon version, yeah, this is a structure that I find tends to be quite pleasant for white, generally speaking. The exception I find for when it works well for black is usually when you have something like white stuck with a bad light squared bishop and black having a good knight, say A5, knight C5. Like if you're able to get something like this where the knight gets to D4 and the bishop's really bad, like that's kind of the dream situation strategically for black. And that you can also kind of figure that the exchange of the dark square bishop also will typically be in black's favor. I mean, it's sort of a given that exchange of mine pieces will typically favor black here. But there can be some exceptions where often you can put your knight on D5 as white, where if they go E6, then the D6 pawn becomes weak. But if they take with a piece, you can either like play C takes D5 and again have this kind of nice King's Indian structure sometimes. Or you can play ED5, and that's also a structure you'll see a lot where you kind of have that pressure on E7. You kind of just neutralize their queen type counterplay, like often they're going to go for more of a blockade than trying to sort of negate this sort of plan. But then you can pressure the E file, you can sort of attack them on the king side just using your extra space. And even though there are some cases where black can still defend it, it is definitely a pleasant kind of structure for white, generally speaking. And black usually needs some sort of compensating factor to kind of make this work, like being able to play B5 or like it being more of an endgame where maybe H4, H5 is not going to be quite as much of a concern. So that's kind of some of the ideas, like just in terms of how the structure can transform. It's definitely very nice if black again A4, because then you have a very clear plan of being able to attack that C4 pawn. And make if white plays B3, you can kind of take and sort of open up the A file and then pressure the B3 pawn as kind of your source of counterplay. You tend not to see plans like F5 so much, just because they do like this. The weakness of the position tends to not really be worth it. You're kind of like opening up your king and not really getting the dynamism you're looking for when the E7 pawn's backward. So this is definitely a lot more of a defensive setup for black. There are some funny ideas where some see like H5, King H7, the Queen swing to H8. But again, it's more defensive than really aggressive. And like the best advice I'd give for black is I would try to not let white get to this structure comfortably, or make sure you're getting in A5, A4 in time so you get that queenside counterplay to justify it. It might not give you a quality, but at least it'll give you a playable position rather than sitting in here waiting for the hammer to fall in a sense. And also often white will play more solid moves like f3, like f4 can sometimes be a bit overextending if you don't play it in exactly the right kind of version. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, moving on to some other structures. Yeah, this one you might recall from like the Rossolimo. I mean, if you play the Alakin and they kind of play it a bit too passively, you can also get it that way a lot at the club or online level. But basically, this structure is kind of about flexibility. That white is not necessarily going to rush to a move like d5 or e5. You're going to kind of wait for the right time to play it. Also, if they play cd4, yeah, it makes sense that that does give you c3 for the knight. So that can also be a nice little sort of way you can, yeah, sort of increase your advantage. And also does explain why black usually, if they're a strong player, will keep that tension between the pawns more. So that if you play d5, well, maybe they could take, or sometimes I might even play e5 and then you get more towards that Spanish structure I showed you before, which again explains why I covered e5 before c5 here, even though c5 maybe has a little bit wider range of positions possibly. But also if white plays e5, you can kind of again see the parallel that if black does exchange, it kind of leads more to an Alakin Sicilian type of structure that we'll see a bit later. So a lot of it is kind of just about like putting the piece on the right squares, like the Lopez maneuver, maybe putting the bishop on e3, looking for the right moment to kind of play more on the flanks, like try to create some additional weaknesses before we kind of commit ourselves to the center. And from Black's point of view, yeah, they're sort of struggling a little bit to find a good pawn break here. Let's just say I put some pawn moves in just to remove the arrows. Because again, e5, I already mentioned how we could beat that with d5. And if they play d5, yeah, you go e5 as have like a turbocharged French defense, where they didn't get that pressure on the d4 pawn in time because we managed to, get all our pieces developed as such. So those are kind of the basic ideas. Like, this is not a structure I want to spend too much time on, saying it is fairly intuitive for most people once you have a few ideas like this to work with. But yeah, Black's going to be relying a little bit more on the queenside counterplay and a bit less on hitting back in the center, unless there's like some tactical reason why the closing the position doesn't work for white. So yeah, with that, let's move on to another structure. This special commands like it's a very unusual kind of structure, so you don't really see it much nowadays. But White's idea is mainly to sort of try to provoke a move like e4 and then kind of go after the center that way. But usually Black has enough counterplay with the unopposed dark square bishop, but they can usually kind of make it work in a sense. Like lock and see the pieces kind of steadily move over in a sort of direction. And then I kind of swing over the attack as well. So you'll also often see plans of like a4 where you kind of try to attack the a6 pawn. And also sometimes you can also play g3 and just try to play very defensively, just giving yourself a bit of protection against the opponent's unopposed dark squared bishop. But again, it's like very, very concrete. Like for 99% of people, this won't be the most relevant. So that's why I'm only mentioning it very, very briefly for comprehensiveness. But this structure is one that can occur a bit more often in the special golf, where you'll often see black, yeah, have f5 and just have this very strong center. Usually white has knight on d5, so it's not like you go d5 and just completely dominate the center most of the time. But there are ways which you can play moves like e4, get e5 for the knights, and try to get some active play. I know the kings and castles short, so you're going to like try to play with the active pieces. Often you'll see white play a move like a4, and like that'll often be one of their main ways to create chances. Again, sometimes you'll kind of see them try to provoke a move like e4. So they can either use the f4 outpost to blockade the center, or again go f3 and kind of try to chip away at the center that way. Those are kind of the main ideas in this position. Like you don't really see this sort of come up that much these days anymore, but it's a structure it's good to know just for our understanding of how the dynamics can kind of compensate for structural weaknesses and how that can sort of look in practice. And yeah, this structure actually, it's funny, I included here because it is basically just the Najdorf structure we talked about before. But you can definitely get it from a Sveshnikov and a Kalashnikov in different versions also, like say with knight d5, bishop f6 in the Sveshnikov, or a Kalashnikov where you put the knight on c3. The difference basically with the Sveshnikov and Kalashnikov versions is that you do have this misplaced knight on a3. And so what's going to happen is you're going to end up spending quite a bit of time trying to bring that knight towards the d5 outpost. You can also use b4 as well, depending on the version, but usually a knight c6 is covering it. So yeah, basically that's kind of the idea is again, you go a4 and you try to, weaken their queen side and king side in the, yeah, you try to weaken their queen side in the Sveshnikov version. In the Sveshnikov also f5 tends to work a lot more effectively because of the fact that what the time White loses game there, 9 a3 backgame kind of allows you to, to make that counterplay work. There are also some modern versions where starting to see White push the H pawn, trying to create chances that way. It's a very situational idea, but it is one to know about if you're a more advanced player. So those are kind of some of the main ideas to sort of work with in terms of the pawn break. It's one where Black also has the bishop pair and where White has a very solid position with no weaknesses. So it's one where kind of both sides are often happy to slowly build up and kind of try to outmaneuver the other. And there's also the version, of course, of like C4, B4, which it's basically just kind of like a safer version where like it's harder for either side to get a break in. Like A3 doesn't really do that much for white, but also F5 is just going to be a lot less effective. So it's going to see a lot more kind of slow maneuvering and yeah, just basically playing more with the pieces than with the pawns. There are some versions where you can kind of go F4, F5 and try to build up a kingside attack, but again, that is very situational, and you have to also be careful that they don't have EF4 and kind of opening up position for the bishops. So yeah, you do want to kind of keep in mind, yeah, like there are going to be pros and cons to each pawn break in this case for both sides. Yeah, also if you play B3 times, they can go A4 and try to get counterplay on the queen side. So something you want to be a bit careful about when you play B3. With that, let's move on to maybe some slightly more common structures. This one being one you can get off from the Najdorf, like I said before, but also from the special code with 95. And basically, also its work around this version is usually better when they have to waste time moving the knight, like in the Najdorf knight's already on D7s, it's kind of less of a problem for black there. But on the simplest level, white wants to basically get in C4 and C5. Either trade off these pawns so you have a passed D pawn, or get in C6 and have an even stronger passed pawn. Whereas black's counterplay is going to be more with their central majority, trying in F5, E4, and really trying to move those pawns forward to have an attack on the king. A little bit like we saw in the Scotch Gambit with cards reversed, actually. Very similar idea that having the two pawns abreast on the fifth rank is going to give us really good dynamic chances. And that's an idea that you might want to write down, by the way, because it is an important one for understanding, like, not just about the pawn structure and pawn break, like about the value of the flexibility of the pawn structure, that having those two pawns side by side really gives you a lot more options in a sense. Sometimes you will see white play moves like F4 to try to fight back, but I do find that these sort of structures, when the knight comes to E5, they are usually going to be okay for black. Like, the one time they're not okay is if white can sort of get in the knight to E6, say if the light square bishops were traded, but most of the time that's not really going to be such a problem. And speaking of the light squared bishops, like it is true, the light squared bishop will usually be white's worst piece in his structure. And that maybe explains a little bit why, like in the special code, we don't really see this kind of thing anymore because, like, it's just very hard to get in these breaks, and black kind of gets good counterplay if you try to open the position. Anyway, they can also kind of steadily build up on the king side in different ways as well. Maybe G5, G4 you don't see as much, but it can sometimes be a thing. Also, if the pawn is on G6, yeah, there can be some versions where like you can, like say if we take the English attack version as an example. Yeah, these days like castling short this is known to be a little bit of a dead end for white. And so you'll tend to see more ideas like long castling and yeah, trying to play it a bit more dynamically, but those are yeah, a bit more kind of concrete type of positions as it were. But actually in the special cop you'll usually see white play for A4, which might seem a little bit weird compared to C4, but kind of the idea is that you're sort of anticipating this A5 B6 blockade. Like if they play A5 now, you're kind of saying, well, now B5 is weak. My knight is going to be sitting very pretty there, and you want to go F4. I can then try to attack D6, stuff like that. But if they sort of let you play A5, well, then kind of the idea is that, well, now B6 we can kind of take and weaken their structure a bit. I mean, it's going to be a lot easier to get in C4, B4, and C5 in the future. And if they play F5, well, no problem. We can go F4 and again kind of hit back where, if they do play E4, well, now the structure's closed and we have a very easy attack. Whereas their pawn break is a lot less effective and a lot harder to get in. And if they keep the tension, well, we can choose the right moment to take, or we can just keep the tension ourselves and wait for that right moment to get into C5 break. Whereas again, black sort of releasing a tension might be a bit harder to achieve. Or resolving a tension, so it would be a bit harder to achieve. So that's kind of a few different concepts. And again, if you sort of play through a lot of GM games, these lines, I think that these ideas will be a lot clearer and a lot more direct for you. But those are the patterns really to look out for when you play through different games. These lines, it'll really help you to understand like how these positions play out. So with that, let's move on to this, and this is kind of just again like the good version of the central majority structure for black. You could say queenside majority structure, like that's the term I usually use, but if you want to say central majority, that also works, of course. But certainly we can kind of see here there's a much better version where like white has managed to get their majority moving. Like we might imagine, say, a white knight on c3 kind of blocking the pawns and taking away that flexibility. You could say if they move the knight, maybe the c2 pawn is lost from the pressure from a rook. It's sort of thing I felt was kind of almost a bit too obvious to mention, but it is true that in your opening you do have that half open c file for the rook, which will be a major source of your piece counterplay, just generally speaking. But like if you can get the pawn on f5 without white being able to sort of exploit the weaknesses left behind on the d file, well then you can suddenly again start to go e4, like increase your space advantage. Like if they play f3 to stop it, well now the king suddenly got quite a bit weaker. And so you can even just say very directly time just go for an attack and just try to make their king using your space advantage is one of the four attacking advantages, one that a lot of players often forget about. So again, a good one to write down if you haven't heard of this idea of the more space you have around the king, the more likely your attack is to succeed. It's a good one to get on paper or in your note taker. Also, from worth pointing out that there is another plan that sometimes you can also go for minority attack as well. Okay, the pawn shot a bit far ahead, but if I show this on the board, you can kind of see how, like, if white takes, again, their majority is less valuable. A2 is a bit of a target. If they play A3, they have a passed pawn, but also an isolated pawn after that. Maybe that piece also plays they can't even play the move A3 and they're stuck with some piece just passively defending the pawn, while our majority is a lot more flexible, a lot more mobile. And if they play a move like A3, well then you can either go B4 and then you have a hook that's going to create potentially even more weaknesses in the white structure, even more open lines for our pieces. Or if we play like A4, we kind of see again their majority can't really move forward so easily. So we just completely neutralize three pawns with just two. It's kind of an economy of defense isn't the perfect terminology, but that's basically the idea that you're using here. That your two pawns are as good as Z3. That's what we're leveraging. So those are kind of the main ideas. Like as white, the main thing you can mainly do is just to try to take the initiative. Like say, put a knight on d5, try to get a piece in the d6, maybe occupy the d file. Usually, you're going to need piece play to compensate because the structure is just very, very good for black when they can get their pawns forward like this with impunity in the center. Okay, with that, let's move to the this one's like a sort of pure dragon structure. Like this is one which again, it ties a lot more to piece play. Like the pawn breaks are mainly like h4, h5, open the h file and go for the attack. Usually you're pretty happy actually if they take it with the knight because then you just kind of just get a much faster attack with the h file open for you. Whereas let's say in this version, also by the way, when you take, they usually should play fg6 and not open that h file for you. Like it does weaken the king a bit and it does explain a little why you'll sometimes see why put the bishop on b3 in those kind of positions, but on like c4, b3 in these kind of positions to avoid this option. But that's sort of the ideas White's going for in terms of the attack. Like it's very obvious what White's going for, and like the attacking idea is like you don't have to be like a genius by any means to kind of to execute this as White. But in terms of how Black will respond, they'll usually play a move like h5 just to try to stabilize. Every now and then you'll see White play g4 first, trying to avoid h5. So that if h5, if say they do get in, you can either take or you go g5 to have that strategic advantage with the extra space and some clear pawn breaks to work with. This idea is why was a major reason why the Dragonov isn't really considered so playable for Black anymore. But at least not in the current version. Like usually they need to have h5 if they want to make the Dragonov kind of work before White gets in this. But sort of talking about Black's queenside counterplay, it will involve a lot of like b5, b4. Sometimes you don't even want to play a6, you want to try to make it work tactically in some positions. But that's really kind of the main thing that Black is going for to get something like this in. The main way the structure can really transform again is with ed5, which I know we kind of talked about a bit before with the pawn on c4, but it is a bit different with the pawn on c2, where Black does have a lot more counterplay in comparison. So instead of it just being better for White, it is kind of close to being balanced in a lot of these cases, like in the Taimanov variation, for example. So those are kind of the main ideas. One strategic trap to avoid, by the way, is that if they play a5, you don't really want to do this because it just allows you to block the queen side in your favor. Just one little pre-ohm that's kind of good to know to save yourself a lot of heartache. And you don't really see d5 that often, like usually because white just avoids it, realizing that black is able to again like trade the pawns like this. Like again, you just have a very nice central majority structure where you have that weakening of bc6 like we saw in the version a bit earlier. So that's kind of the dream, and yeah, you don't really see e5. Like I know there are a lot of like juniors and club players who for some reason think e5 is a good idea, so they sort of Najdorf. But that just kills your bishop and just makes your d6 pawn passive. So like just don't play the move e5 unless you have like an insanely good reason. Like if you can play d5 on the very next move and take over the center, then yeah, maybe. But otherwise, probably not going to be so effective, generally speaking. So yeah, those are the main ideas. Also, the rook takes c3 exchange. Like is one of Black's main ideas for creating counterplay. So it is a good one to know about, of course, even if doesn't relate quite as directly to the structure. You definitely want to know it as a dragon player with either side. Okay, moving to the classical dragon. You also could have this the pawn f2 to be fair, but these structures have been a little bit trendy lately in some different versions, like with the queen takes d4 lines, for instance, like Hungarian variation. So basically, white's main plan is often going to be trying to put the knight on d5, and basically trying to get this ed5 structure we kind of were talking about a little bit earlier, for where black's not going to have that counterplay on the queen side so readily when we haven't cast that king there. That's really the key distinction with the classical dragon is when the king's on g1, yeah, you're not really going to be playing the mate their king so directly. I mean, you can definitely play moves like e5, and there might be some special versions that go g4, g5. I will say a lot of the time that will backfire if you're not careful, but in the long term. But yeah, a lot of the ideas are going to be kind of similar to what we saw that yeah, kind of accidentally took my own pawn. But yeah, basically, yeah, black's going to be going for that counterplay on the queen side, moving the pawns forward, trying to create some weaknesses here, and white's going to try and do something, but the reality is that Black's King is just very well defended, and it's going to be very hard to kind of break through a direct attack. And like I said, that's kind of the reason why you tend to see White going more for this knight d5 as their way to try to set problems like knight d5, bishop d5, and put them in a dilemma where either they take and we get that ed5 structure we want, or they try to like keep the tension with knight d7, but then you have some annoying pressure on e7 that maybe makes it a bit hard for Black to get 100% equality in that case. So, and usually the way Black will avoid it will just be with having enough active piece play that White just doesn't get that sort of control. So, yeah, it's sure it's objectively going to be fine for Black, but White has a few ways to try to set some practical problems. And of course, yeah, there are usual ideas like you can meet a6 with a4, and you can also try to hold back b5, which you might not hold it back forever, but you can at least, slow Black down in some ways. Anyway, moving on to some other ideas. Yeah, this dragon structure, this is one that does occur in a few different versions, and I was going to take a short pause. I've been recording for a while, like my back is like telling me to take a rest. But basically, yeah, this version is a very nice structure for black. Because as we kind of seen before, like the main problem with the structure often like white's trying to go problem isn't really the right word, but like often white's going to try to use that d5 square in some way, saying, well, you can't go e6 because then d6 is going to be weak. But when that square is covered, then white doesn't really have as obvious a plan. And I mean, I guess the main plan would be to try to do something on the king side, like try to get some attack going. But again, it's just very hard when black has this very strong defense to the king set up with the dragon bishop, for example. Which is why some of white's better plans will involve trying to trade that bishop before you attack. There's a few styles of plays like Taimanov tried to play. But really it's more about black's ideas. Like black kind of has more ideas, like they can move their bishop to get that pressure down the b file. Sometimes you can also push the a pawn and try to create some weaknesses that way. You have to be a bit careful though. There are some versions where that pawn can end up being a little bit of a weakness if it moves a bit too far, so you do want to be a bit careful when you play it. But also with the center, you also can kind of play moves like d5 sometimes. I mean, d5 tends to work well when they can't play e5 in response, just as a general point. Like this is usually going to be an improvement of the structure for white. So, but the thing is, you also just have like the central majority is going to be a long-term advantage. So, generally, you are just going to be playing kind of more with the pieces, just steadily moving your piece kind of in the direction of the queen side, and that's just going to give you very nice play. So, it's a lot of arrows, but this is just kind of make sure we cover a structure that there aren't going to be many good GM games to look at in terms of model games, but that's sort of what you can sort of derive from my experience playing these positions a lot. And with that, we head to the Rossolimo structure with bishop c6, dc6. You only really tend to see it in the g6 version, because what really makes this click for black is the fact that they can sort of try to bring their knight towards d4 in the middle game, so that all of their pieces will really come to very nice squares. At the same time, it is also true that black structure is a lot less flexible. Normally, you will see black play to move e5 at some point, just because without the space, it's kind of hard to get the counterplay. And black's going to play very defensively, like they might play b6, they might play f6. And then you go to the right move, they might eventually play like f5 or c4 to break through, but it might be like on move 20, 25, or even later. Like you're going to have all the pieces on exactly the right squares before you strike as black. It definitely is more of a defensive setup. Because also if you wait till like maybe white goes f4, if say the knight's not on f3 already, which it usually is. But this is kind of like a very nice sort of Grand Prix for white, where they're not getting their usual counterplay. And you can still, kind of go for your usual sort of attacking ideas that we'll get into in the Grand Prix coverage later. But as for the pawn e5, yeah, white really has two main pawn breaks that are going to be quite effective. The first is to play f4, and a lot of the time you will be kind of moving that knight out of the way to prepare f4, because if you can get it immediately, it's just an amazing version for white. Like if you're able to trade off these pawns, then well, your pawn structure is a lot more solid. It also kind of negates their unopposed light square bishop that they have when you've traded on c6 for the knight. Like to be fair, I probably should have like included like these pieces of like the knight f3, bishop c1, bishop e7, bishop c8. That would have made the picture a bit clearer, but you can kind of see how our pawns being on light squares just completely neutralizes their unopposed bishop. Again, following Kablanca's principle. And again, if you can trade off the light squared, the dark squared bishops, and that gets rid of their main advantage of the bishop there. That really allows them to compensate for having less flexible structure. And I mean, that's really what Black's relying on. They're relying on the fact that, well, in order to leverage our banks, we'll need to open the position at some point, like say with a3 and b4 being kind of the other plan. But in doing so, they're also kind of, opening up the position for the bishops a little bit. Obviously, I meant to play a takes b4 there. And it's worth pointing out this structure is actually a bit better for white as well. Even though you want to double the pawn to get that pressure against the a pawn, that can be especially annoying if black played b6, like that pawn is a backward pawn after all. But even if they haven't played b6, you just have one pawn island versus two. That just gives your structure so much more flexibility. So that's really what you're kind of aiming for with that. And if they play a5, you also don't have to worry about them castling long, so you can kind of, like sometimes you can even play a4 as well. Like there are ideas where you kind of just play like a bit more slowly and strategically. Sometimes also you can get in a move like a4, a5. That can also be a way to, maybe discourage b6 and try to sort of isolate the pawn on c5 as potentially a little bit more of a target. You tend not to see c3 and d4 quite as much. You tend to see that a lot more in the Berlin equivalent. So like if let's say what would be a good, like let's say if the pawn goes to g7, if we have something like this, and the black pawn goes to c7, like that would be the anti-Berlin version, which I say not to cover it separately, like maybe it's a little bit of a gap, but again, a lot of the similar ideas will apply. Where again, black's going to be playing it more defensively, like trying to bring their knight towards d4 is going to be like a pretty normal sort of plan. They can also try to expand on with the Brooks pawns. White also has different ideas of trying to pair f4. One difference with the pawn c7, like the main difference is that you do have the option of playing for c3 and d4, which it is a bit situational, but basically you're aiming for a structure like this where you just have the full control over the center and full occupation of the center. And if they keep the tension, well, you can sort of keep it as well, or wait for the right moment to take. And yeah, it opens up the position for their bishop pair, but it does isolate the pawns. Again, it kind of depends on the position how you're going to play it, but that's sort of the main difference in terms of the anti-Berlin version versus the Rossolimo version, just so that's clear. And also in the E4 E5 version, like with the pawn G6, obviously like putting the knight on F5 in different versions can become a little bit more legitimate. But anyway, that's just kind of breakdown, this sort of structure. And yeah, it was good that we covered the anti-Berlin one briefly because it is quite trendy these days at a high level, even if you might not face it maybe quite as much at a lower level. As for the BC6 version, you're kind of strategically in the long term, it's kind of nice to have the bit better central control and a bit more flexibility with the structure. But the price you pay for it, though, is that you are kind of behind in development. And a way in which White's often going to really use that is to be able to play like c3 and d4 and just take over the center. I find that when playing this at a club level, a lot of my opponents were playing like d3 and just playing it very passively. But that just kind of plays into black's hands, but I can kind of just go for this pawn stop and have this really strong attack on the king. And if you're not able to kind of open up the center quickly, then you're just going to end up kind of getting steamrolled here as white, which is not really ideal, of course. So that's why you're usually going to see more ideas like this rook e1, c3, d4. And you're trying to get a structure like, didn't mean for the pawn to vanish like that. But you're going to get a structure kind of like this, where you sort of go d4. The reason that I played h3 was just so you're not worrying about like bishop g4 stuff. You're going to kind of get a structure kind of like this one, where you sort of, yeah, just have the extra space. It's kind of hard for them to open up the position for the bishops because kind of, even though they have a lot of pawn breaks in theory, all of them kind of have some different little problems. And yeah, you just again, like, you just have this bit better structure, a bit more space to kind of work with. And it's really, it ties into just having a more flexible structure when all of their pawn breaks have drawbacks. So that's kind of the ideas to sort of work with there. And if they play the E6 version, I didn't want to sort of cover it separately. Basically, Black's dream is to get a structure like this once again, kind of like we saw in the G6 version. In this version, okay, the bishop might be on E7 instead, but still you've got that dynamic play with F5 and such. Whereas what you're generally trying to avoid is you're generally trying to avoid a structure like this one, where the pawn is fixed in place, and again by getting rid of all of the major pieces in one pair of knights and kings, you can really see clearly how we have like one more attacker of c5 than they have a defender. And even though with the other piece on, maybe they can defend it like the queen or something, you can sort of see how Black's piece gets so tied up, and that is going to be a really big problem for Black in this kind of structure. So that's really kind of the battle. Like, can Black get in this sort of d6, e5 without worrying about, something like, let's say, f4, for example, which can be a way to, try to undermine the structure. But Black does have the bishop here to compensate. It's not like the world's biggest problem, but it is a break that's good to kind of know in a sense. And then there are also different subtleties, like sometimes you'll see White playing moves like h4 to not let them stabilize with knight g6, e5. So sometimes you get some versions like this where you kind of play e5 before they play d6. And that's often going to lead to kind of this sort of structure where like they have the double pawns and isolated, but they're going to kind of have enough counterplay with their strong center and the bishop bed, they can kind of make it work. But the positions are definitely very interesting, and yeah, I do realize like this video is getting quite long, but I do think these sort of long form videos like it really, in order to understand things like a GM, like you have to go deep sometimes. So that's what we're doing here. We're going deep and taking it, and you don't just have surface level off the double pawns of weak, let's attack them, but like seeing how the different patterns kind of emerge and what patterns you should really be looking out for, and trying to ingrain in your long-term memory as you go through the model games. And like I said, yeah, you're just going to retain what you learned from those Grandmaster and Master games so much better when you kind of already have seen the theme previously without the piece on the board. So, and this one, yeah, kind of is just sort of tying into the queen time majority structure, that when you have this sort of tension, what's going to happen most of the time is that the pawn's going to get traded either with CD4, take the pawn, and you get the queen time majority structure that way. Or obviously, if you play DC5 and then they take back, say, with the bishop, you're going to get the same structure. So it's kind of like sort of a transition structure in that sense that you'll often get in like some French defenses. And also sometimes in the Caro-Kann, like if the pawn was on C6 and then you play C5, and you can kind of see how that plays out. And also you can get in some D4 versions, like with the pawn C4, that kind of fits. That fits a lot better in the part two, to be fair. But just mentioning it just so you know it exists. But also there are some points where like White can try to play D5. Like I find that the ideal response in a vacuum is to be able to play D5 and set it after takes, and you take back, like you have the initiative with your lead in development. This pawn kind of sticks out, kind of just being a bit of a weakness, whereas you can kind of cover knight D4 easily with your own C pawn. So that's kind of like what you're aiming for in this transition structure. Like if you can meet C5 with D5, that's the dream, but if White can't, then C5 is probably going to be a good idea from Black's perspective. And I kind of implied it before, but like obviously you saw ideas work with colors reversed. Like if you had this position like what would be the reverse version. Yeah, like if you have something like this, like you can kind of see, yeah, this would be like more the version you get from D4, just to kind of like put it together in your mind in case those connections aren't happening automatically. Now, then now we can kind of talk a little bit more about the queen time majority structure, which I've already mentioned a few different times in, like, say, the E5 version, the Open Sicilian, but it's cool to see it in this version too, because you can really get it a lot of different ways. And so the tip I would kind of give for white to really, and this is one actually I've been giving for like, I think 13 years by now in my lessons, but I find that if your bishop is pointing towards the queen side, you're going to want to be playing more for queen side sort of player. There are some exceptions to this as well, but as a general point, yeah, if your bishop is pointing more towards the queen side, you kind of want to play more to just steadily expand that queen side majority. And because the kings are usually on the king side, what will often happen is that exchanges of pieces will actually increase your advantage because it kind of makes it easier for you to create a passed pawn, first of all. And second, it also makes that passed pawn a lot more valuable. And also, if they do push a pawn trying to like hold your pawns back, like it also kind of makes it easier for you to create a passed pawn. And also makes it easier to kind of create weaknesses where you might be able to say, trade off the pawn so that this pawn becomes a weakness, or this pawn becomes isolated and so a lot easier to target. You also get a b5 square as an outpost for a knight, which can be quite nice. So you can sort of see how you use the opponent's sort of structural decisions against them. Like if they play a6, well, we can go a4, a5, and again fix 2 pawns with one economy of pawn play, keeping the flexibility and reducing their flexibility at the same time. And the other part of it, by the way, is that if your bishop is on a square like d3, let's just say I play h6 just so that I don't have so many arrows, well, then our bishop is pointing towards the more the king side, right? And so you're going to be playing more pieces like knight e5, queen in the attack, maybe a bishop can sack when it pawns on h6, the rook swings over, maybe this rook swings over. You're just going to swing all the pieces to the attack, you're going to play a lot more with pieces. And Black's counterplay there is going to be looking more like trying to play on the queen side with the pawns, but also it's going to get to be more piece play, like trying to maybe, trade off this attacking d3 bishop. That's kind of the key attacker to make those kingside attacks work. If white tries to cover it, well, maybe I'll the attack to open lines so that white doesn't attack so easily, or you could trade off the rooks and make some exchanges to neutralize the attack that sort of way. Also, a bit more of an advanced idea is that sometimes you can also use the H pawn again to create attacking chances. That you get that pawn to H6 if they play G6 again. I've mentioned this a billion times, and you sort of, I think it's starting to get a little bit more into long-term memory by now. Realizing, okay, if they play H6, well now their structure is very inflexible. If they play E5, F5 becomes weak. Let me just put another move on the board just to make it a bit clear. If E5 is played, F5 becomes weak. If they move the F pawn, well, G6 is now a hole. Imagine a knight going into that outpost. That might give some mating ideas in the end game if you get a rook in as well. If they move the G pawn, well, we're very happy with that because now their king is so weak, they have more pawn islands. So you can kind of see how the advance the H pawn is sort of creating some chances for ourselves. And unlike in the dragon, like not really in a spot to beat H12, H5, because that just makes G5 way too much of a weakness. So yeah, those are some ideas you can kind of work with to sort of create chances here. I mean, you don't really tend to see this as much from like it. It definitely is more of an idea from my point of view. So that's a few different ideas to work with, and I definitely could have gone like deeper into some aspects. Like for example, I could have talked about how like you want to play B3, not A3, because again, you don't want to let them fix 2 of your pawns with one of theirs if you can help it. But yeah, I think you sort of are picking that up kind of intuitively just from some similar examples. Also, I will mention you don't really want to rush with F4 a lot of the time because that will often just weaken your king a bit too much. So that's why again, play more with the pieces when you're trying to attack on the king side. And if you're going to use a pawn, use the H. So with that, let's move on to. And I mean, I also will admit I didn't mention this sort of idea, but I didn't talk about it earlier. So yeah, again, it's kind of implied. Okay, I think now we can finally move on to the next part because, yeah, the Queensland Majority is just one of the most important structures. Like, if there's one training you're going to want to revisit, it's probably going to be that one, like in terms of that part of the video. But yeah, basically, this sort of structure, you can get a lot of different versions. Like, we even saw it very briefly, the Royal Lopez, but the version I was kind of thinking of was sort of the line of the Sicilian, where you have like knight c3, e5. Because if I can get an f4, I mean, this just would be a dream for white to attack the center. But if, I don't know, that would also make the structure not very good for black. But if white's not stuck on f3, you don't have that pawn break, then that's what sort of makes it work for black. Because then it just takes a very long time to like get in f4 because you know just go back and forth. Or you have to play like h3, knight h2, or knight around this way. I know those are legitimate maneuvers that are good to know, but they do tend to be a little bit slow. And it's sort of the reason why black can sort of keep their disadvantage to a minimum. Also, black's bad piece will usually be their bishop, so you're going to go bishop g5. let me put a move on the board just to be clear, but they're often going to try to trade their bishop with bishop g5. They can try to get some counterplay with b5, but a lot of the time, like a6, a4 will kind of neutralize it. Okay, I didn't mean to take my own pawn, but if you've got like knight c3, bishop c4, you can kind of see how that's a bit hard to get in. I will say, also I will add that there is also the pawn break of like f5 is also a, it is a plan that exists for black, but at times it's hard to get in because you have to move the knight first, and maybe white's knight jumps the outpost. So, and also the bishop on c4 does mean you sometimes need to prepare it to make it kind of work. But I will say that if you've got the version with g3, g6 in, and I mean, to be fair, this version probably fits a little bit better in part two, but I do want to mention that this sort of plan does tend to work very well if white's got the bishop on g2. And white's better plans will tend to involve like trying to play on the king side. Again, if you can get f4, that will be kind of nice in a way, but it's hard if your knight's on f3 already. Sometimes you can also play a4 and put the knight on c4 and play more strategically, but that does tend to be a bit too slow. And also you sometimes go at d5, and that can lead to this transformation of more of a reverse Team Keto King's Indian structure. So it's a lot of ideas. Like this one I could have saved for part two, but I just wanted to kind of introduce it now. Certainly in case if you don't get to part two for whatever reason, at least you kind of have a little bit of an idea what's going on there. Anyway, moving to the Khan style structures. Yeah, basically this difference here is seeing that white's playing a4 to not let b5, b4 counterplay happen. And in that case, yeah, you're often going to see like in the Scheveningen, like the bishops on d3 and d2, or bishop on d3 on and e3, like kind of with d2, you're keeping the option to play e5. Whereas with e3, it's obviously a bit better of square for the bishop in terms of mobility. But black also has like a very flexible setup where they're not necessarily forced to like castle short and let you go for like your e4, g4, g5, like queen h5, rook f3, h3 kind of attack. Yeah, they can also keep the king on e8, and for example, they might play a move like h5 and just make it kind of hard for you to attack on the king's side. The trade-off though is it does make some of these ideas like e5 and f5 a bit more effective, so you do want to be a bit careful with the timing h5, but it's kind of one of these more advanced ideas that as you start to play the opening more, it is kind of a good one to know. And also, by the way, if I'll just play h6 just to remove some of the arrows, but I do find if white does threaten the move of e5, that again, like in the Najdorf, this e5 can also work sometimes in the Khan as well. Because having the bishop on b7 also kind of helps cover it, and like if they go f5, you can often get it d5 in time before they can really clamp down on the d5 square. So it's just a few ideas to kind of work with, just expanding on what I kind of mentioned before. So moving on to yeah, this structure's a bit of a rare one. Like I kind of won't talk too deeply about it, but the general idea is basically that black wants to go e5 and kind of keep a symmetrical structure. But first they lose a tempo, and second, white also can kind of just really sort of use these squares to their advantage. Like if you get an a5, the structure is very inflexible. And often you get black sort of playing more of a solid quality, more necessarily playing for a win here. And also if they do try to play b5, you often just go a4 and you get this unpleasant pressure where you use your space advantage, or if they go b4, you get the c4 square as an outpost for the knight. This structure is sort of less bad for black if at least you're able to kick away knight c3, because then you often kind of gain 2 tempi compared to if knight's on b1. But this is sort of the reason why I'm not really a big fan of these structures. So it works a lot better if the move c4 is played, because then you kind of have the whole on d4, and those ideas come a little bit more in the King's Indian sort of ideas for part two for that structure. But yeah, just so you can kind of see the connections between them. With that, let's move on to, and again, this is like the 4-9 structure where if you can get the knight to d6, you're very, very happy. But usually black's going to have like enough counterplay like bishop e4, knight e3, and this sort of thing that they're going to be able to kind of make it work. And often you're also going to see a move like f5 being played, where you're sort of able to either have like this knight d6, you kind of get this structure, and then you sort of play around the d6 pawn, like you sort of trade off enough pieces like the knight and the dark square bishop. There's not that big of a problem that white has this extra space. And you do also like have some dynamic play as well, like b3, a5, a4 is one way to try and create some weaknesses whites can. But also if you play like knight f2 again, they can go c5, they can try to play d6 and sort of make it work that way. So yeah, so these ideas like they definitely make more sense with the piece on the board. But if you do look at the 4-9's like strategy behind the tactics, that's kind of where it comes from. Also, to be fair, you also can get this structure of like EF6 where they take back. Usually, actually, they take back with a piece rather than with a pawn. But you can kind of get different version of these structures where, yeah, Black Soldier tries to play in the center, but their king can sometimes be a little bit exposed. So there's ideas like that. Again, probably a bit too concrete to really dive into here, but just at least you know what the different types of restrictions are, like what different structures are arising from this knight takes C6 4 knights. And yeah, with the IQP with the E pawn. So I talked about a lot of the ideas with the C pawn, and there is a lot of overlap, but there are also a couple of differences where, like, probably the main difference is that Black can develop knight to C6, like they're not having to, be finicking around with like knight C7, knight B6, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, we also see that bishop is a bit more stuck, where they're often going to be playing b6 and bishop b7 to kind of free that piece. Let's just say I kind of put the pawn on like a3 just to remove some of the arrows. White sort of attack again is going to be very similar to the ideas I showed before. With the pawn on e6, you're not really going to see the knight on c5 so much like we saw with the pawn on c6. Like here, you're definitely committing a lot more towards the attack on the king. But also, you can kind of make rook flips happen a bit more easily when a bishop is not covering that square. Also, a lot of times with bishop g5, you do want to be a bit careful with bishop g5 because what will sometimes happen is there'll be some versions where you can like trade off your bishops and kind of achieve their goal of trading off the minor pieces, like I kind of mentioned with the C-Pawn version. Like that's sort of a commonality between the two versions. Like Black definitely wants to trade off minor pieces. Like that's really the dream. Like I'll put the piece on the initial square, like just so you can kind of make that connection, mentally or visually, as it were. But yeah, that's basically Black's plan. Like just blockade this square, trade off minor pieces, eventually win the pawn by lining up Alakin's gun against the pawn, as it were. And as usual, yeah, Black's fairly happy to trade the queens. We're very much playing for the attack on the king. And also, yeah, some people will see like an h4, h5 to back up the battery. If they do play a move like g6, well, that can also, give us a hook to open lines up the pawn, and often you'll see our bishop kind of come around to this diagonal when they play g6, then we kind of switch to the d5 break, where we try to use some of the weaknesses of the dark squares to our advantage. So yeah, that's just a few different patterns you can kind of use to your advantage. And yeah, I mean, these pictures are not really like necessarily better for one side, they just, offer both sides their own respective dynamic versus long-term chances. Okay, moving to, yeah, this version is kind of, yeah, looking from Black's point of view, because you could often get like the French Tarasch or like C5, ed5, that sort of thing. One difference is you'll often notice that in the Tarasch, knight ends up on e7 rather than f6, because if knight f6, like rook e1 check ends up being a bit annoying. So in that version with 97, you are going to be playing it more defensively, and it's a version where, yeah, you kind of may not necessarily mind trading certain pieces if they're kind of like the right pieces to trade. Like you might not be so opposed to trading maybe the light squared bishops, for example, because that bishop might be a little bit stuck otherwise. So it's just kind of ideas like that. Like often the knight will come at f5 to make it hard for white to blockade the d4 pawn, and white often will be happy to trade off the dark squared bishops as like in terms of what piece they want to trade. And knight five, yeah, it does cover bishop e3 as well, but yeah, these ones aren't really so dynamic. They're generally more like strategic, slower paced positions where you're kind of sort of looking to outmaneuver the opponent. So the main thing here is just kind of to be patient and not rush things too much. There are some like little subtleties where like sometimes these pawn moves will be flicked in, and sometimes if they play b6, you can try to like create some weaknesses, but that's like very kind of loosely based. Sometimes knights on b3, like sometimes you can try to create counterplay this way as well as black. So yeah, there's some deeper ideas like that. I will admit these positions probably aren't my biggest area of expertise, but those ideas will at least will kind of be enough to sort of like get you by in a sense. So with that, we'll move on to. Also, I will find as a final point, like often the end games will be like slightly worse for black, but actually not so hard to hold based on the Karpov Portrait World Championship match if you do want to go deeper into it. But yeah, this structure we have here definitely is more of an Alakin Sicilian kind of structure, where if black is able to sort of trade and like trade the queens and just have this heavy pressure against the pawn, then they're usually just doing very well. Like it often happens that the pawn is a bit overextended on e5 as pieces get traded. So as white, what you kind of want to do is you want to sort of keep the pieces on the board, like, have the pieces developed actively, kind of use the pawn as obviously I meant to take. You're kind of using the pawn as sort of like a bulwark for your attack, basically, where you kind of like have the bishop pointing towards their king. Sometimes your knight can try to use the d6 outpost. Often they will have their knight on d5, kind of compensating a little bit for the pawn on e5. But I'd still wager these positions are just going to be a bit easier for white to play. Yeah, black has no real weaknesses. They do lack space, and we have some pretty clear ways to kind of like bring up pieces in the attack. Like we can lift a rook, we can go like h4, h5, h6 once again, and just to really go after that dark square color complex. So those are some of the main attacking ideas. And usually for black to compensate for it, they kind of need something like, say, white having the pawn on c3 that they can then sort of use as a long-term advantage. Or, some other way, like, trade off the pieces so that white's attack is not as serious. Like, if black can trade off the light squared bishop, again, that's the piece that really fuels white's attack. So if they can get rid of it, that does make the defensive task a lot easier. And also, yeah, move like h6, you have to be a bit careful about playing because that can lead to a situation where you have this battery and you'd have to play g6, but then you lose h6. So there's all subtleties like that you also have to be a bit careful of, which also apply in the IQP positions, by the way, just so you know. But yeah, moving to some other aspects, yeah, this king's Indian attack. Normally in this version, you're not going to have the pawn on f4. Like, it might look nice to have the pawn on f4, but sometimes it just gets in the way of your pieces, and you almost prefer to have like the bishop on f4. And in terms of like the attacking plan, like often you're just going like h4 and just moving that h pawn forward to build up the attack and create weaknesses around the king, because both sides are usually casting short. Like if they castle long, you can kind of go like for a3, b4 and open them up that way. Maybe I'll use a different colored arrow to elucidate the point. But then yeah, in terms of black's plans, I mean they're playing on the side where their pawn chain's pointing like b5. They want to try to open up the queen side in their favor, and yeah, this is like be a typical way to do it. Like sometimes I go d4, sometimes I go c4. It kind of depends on the position, but you do want to be a little bit careful because d4 does give some squares to your white's pieces. And c4, d4 can give white a really good friend. So you do usually want to play more with the A and B pawns initially, unless there's like a good reason to play d4 or something like that. Like you get something in return. And you also, to work with h4, there are also ideas where you are supporting like knight g5, queen h5. That's definitely an attacking format that can especially work very well at blitz chess. Sometimes you'll see some more advanced players play like a queen e8, f6, try to like defend that way, but again, that's like very, very specific. Also, if the queen's on c7, they do have to be a little bit careful of stuff like some tactics where you sack on d5, play a6. It's very situational, but just something I wanted to mention real quick. And also there's a version with the queen on e2 where you can actually play c4. And it's kind of where you're just saying you have a bit more space. Like if they play d4, your attack just has much higher stakes on the queen's king side than theirs on the queen side. Like you just play b3 and stabilize. And if they play f6, you also kind of take and just sort of use the wings to stay left behind. So it's very hard for black to really find a good pawn break to fight back on the king side. And if they don't, well, you're kind of saying, well, you just have a bit more space. Like you can wait for the right moment to take. I mean, most of the time, you're just going to keep the tension, to be fair. Just like keep that space. Let them kind of make the bad move of taking and giving you a bigger space advantage. Letting them kind of misjudge your tension and maybe miss a good moment for white to go cd5 and e6. And black's counterplay, yeah, is going to come more from moves like b5, like trying to open up the position for their pieces. So, and again, we're often going to see like this h4, h5, h6. It'll come up quite a lot even in the versions where you do keep that tension. So it's kind of like the main way in which you're going to build up an attack as white. And again, if they like meet h5 with h6, well, now their structure is inflexible. And it also kind of will give you a potential for g4, g5 later. So yeah, that's the ideas I want to share there. And for the French, yeah, we're sort of getting like we're over the 2 hour mark, but I think with the amount of structure I've left, like we'd probably be able to get through it within 3 hours is what I will somewhat cautiously say. But if I do go through some of these structures a little bit faster, then that's kind of the reason why, just to make it a bit more of a manageable bit. But basically in this French structure, yeah, it really all comes down to like white has more space, but the d4 pawn can be a bit of a target. And black, the obvious way to attack is just like to bring the knights around to c6 and f5 and use the queen. So I try to be a bit careful with the timing because there are some situations where white might be able to take on c5 and kind of get this good sort of Caro-Kann style structure where maybe some of black's pieces might not be ideally placed perhaps because their bishop is a bit stuck on c8. Like this is the obvious drawback of the setup for black, that the bishop is quite passive. But there are some ideas where they can sort of play like bishop d7, bishop b5, and try to trade off the bad bishop. It is something you see every now and then. Granted, it usually happens a bit earlier, but you sort of get the idea. That's a more strategic approach for black. Some of White's main plans usually involve kind of a mix of either consolidating the center, so for example, playing b4 and kind of resolving the tension early in the center. So h6 isn't really a move. I'm just sort of playing it just to kind of get this on the board. Let me just, yeah, there was sort of something here that was kind of not really working, so I just wanted to change the file to fix that. But like b4 kind of allows you to resolve the tension, like you can defend the pawn with the bishop one way or the other. It also kind of allows you to go knight c3, a4 to kick their queen out of the way. So you can kind of see how like this space does open up a lot of new ideas for white for playing this French structure. The one drawback of a3 is it does give black the option of c4 where they can kind of use this weakness to try to like bring the knight around this way, or try to bring their bishop around to try to get their bishop more active in the structure. I mean, it might look like white is going to destroy black on the king side, but there are ways in which black can, make it that for white to do it does involve opening up their own king. So very interesting strategic battle, may falls a little bit outside the scope of this particular training. The one other idea you'll see that's a bit more advanced, well, kind of two, like for black there is also f6 and try and challenge the center from a second front. You'll often see in the bishop d7 lines. And there's also the version where you actually kind of gambit the pawn, where you kind of let them take again. And you sort of use your lead in development, like you kind of, we'll go h4, h5, you use the c file, you try to make it hard from the castle. But again, that's less structural and more initiative based. But it is good to know that idea does exist, that you can sort of sacrifice your center to get a lead in development and some initiative. Now, with this Steinitz structure, I mean, the way that black usually makes it playable is by kind of getting in a quick queen b6 takes b2. Because if you have the normal version with the castle on opposite sides, like white just has a very easy attack. And I sort of find that with the space advantage, it means that it's a lot harder for black to bring pieces to the attack or to the defense than it is for white in each case. And I mean, you can even just go for a pawn. So like the plans are pretty straightforward, and no way black can really fight back other than the queenside counterplay is to play f6. But then the pawn on e6 becomes a bit weak, because that's kind of the reason why these structures are just traditionally just thought to be a little bit better for white with the pawn on f4. Now it's a little bit less clear cut with the pawn on f2. I mean, in the Caro-Kann version, they kind of need the second tempo to get in the move c5. So that's sort of why in the French it'll be fine for black, and in the Caro-Kann it might be a little better for white. But yeah, you're basically kind of using that pawn as a strong point. Like you can play a3, b4, bishop b2, and just sort of overprotect this pawn, so if they play f6, just ready to open it up for your pieces. The one drawback of playing a3 and b4 is that you have to sometimes be a bit careful of a5, and then kind of using the c5 square as an outpost for the knight. But if they've got a knight on c6 and you're attacking, that kind of makes it work for you, where the two tempo lose is a bit too high of a price to pay. So there's little subtleties like that that kind of allow you to sort of outplay your opponents. You're never really afraid of a5 because it just kind of weakens b5 a little bit too much. And you just like leave black out really a good pawn breaking that structure. But other than that, yeah, it's just basically kind of moving the pieces in a direction of their king. And if you do it in a smart way, yeah, you basically can leave black with no counterplay and just have a really big advantage. And also the c8 bishop is often a problem for black that can be a bit hard to resolve in a normal way. So yeah, that's kind of the reason why the structure can be a bit better for white in the Caro-Kann version, where black's on time able to get that f6 counterplay. But yeah, let's move on to the Steinitz. Like, in terms of this tension battle, like often it will happen at some point while we'll play d5 or black will play cd4. And obviously whoever blinks first, the other player's going to get their piece to a more active square. But there are different ways we can sort of keep the tension, where like black can definitely improve the position of his bad bishop and get that piece active. That's going to be one of the main plans that black can go for. And a way in which white's often going to deal with b4 is to kind of be able to meet b4 with c4 and try to leverage attention in the center in their favor. There's also some other ideas where black can also go f6 and try to get counterplay this way. More rarely you'll see a move like f5, which tends to work well if you kind of get your knight into e4 later as such. Like it comes up in like the bishop e7 Steinitz lines mainly, but like with bishop e2 and stuff. Also, obviously, yeah, white usually wants sort of castle before d5, because if black plays c4, then this attack is just way faster than white's attack, and so this is something you definitely want to try to avoid if you can help it. But on the other hand, in the version, yeah, with castling short, there are definitely ideas we can look into ways to play f5 at the right moments. You probably don't see h4, h5 since quite as much in the short castle version for fairly obvious reasons, but yeah, that's not just a breakdown of what some of the main plans are for both sides, and yeah, just kind of a few things to look out for. Obviously, we can get the move c3, like that's a bit of a different version where you're less concerned about d takes cd4, and black's going to be playing more to try to leverage their lean and develop with direct play. So again, very more like move by move based than strategy, but there are some ideas where you can try like build up an attack as wide if black is careless, for example. Anyway, moving on to the next one. So this structure I won't talk too deeply about, but basically there's two versions. Like the version where both sides castle short is just totally fine for black, but they're kind of able like to trade off some of the better attacking pieces of the white. And the bishop can also kind of come around this way, which is pretty cool. But if you have the long castling version, there are some cool ideas where yeah, you can kind of go like for black's gonna try to attack, but you can also just go for an attack as well. And those dishes can be quite fun. Like you don't really see them much these days, but if you want something that's like low theory, there are some creative ideas you can find there. As for the winner, I mean, it would have been more precise if I'd included the light squared bishops as well. It would have painted an even clearer picture. But you can sort of see that, yeah, structurally, of course, and we'll see later in the McCutcheon how when you don't have that unopposed light dark squared bishop, that the structures end up being very nice for black, and that these sort of like attacking ideas don't really work as well for white. But when you've got the bishop pair and you also got that unopposed bishop, well, it means that that bishop just has a very natural diagonal, but we're sort of not going to necessarily rush with it because sometimes queen a5 will be a bit annoying. So you're just going to be kind of patient and sort of build up the position a bit more steadily. But the way in which white's really been sort of getting an edge lately has been by playing h4, h5, h6, and it's really sort of creating weaknesses on the king side we can use to our advantage. It also kind of makes, castling a little bit less appealing for black. And yeah, and often this h4s will kind of allow you to bring the rook in the attack and target some of those weaknesses. They're not so easy to cover now. There's no light squared bishop, so those are kind of the main ideas for white. For black, the main strategic idea is basically to trade off this bad light squared bishop with b6, bishop a6 in different versions. Like only really in the queen g4 lines do you really sort of see that not come up so much because those are, white's playing queen g7 is just a lot more move by move based. But yeah, those are sort of some ideas you can work as a starting point. And I know it doesn't tell the full story, but it's definitely enough, I think, for at least these editions not to feel completely overwhelming the first time you see it. But yeah, as for the Rubinstein structure, again, like you could get this from a Scandinavian if the pawn was back on e7. The difference with the Rubinstein and French is that the bishop is a little bit stuck, which is sometimes you see black played in Fort Knox with bishop d7, c6 to try to improve it. But really the main plan for black is to play c5 and try to get this attack. And the plan I've sort of noticed working the best white is kind of the one where you sort of go like bishop d3, bishop e3, queen e2 long castles. It just gives you a really nice harmony where you, with the bishop on e3, just kind of discouraging the move c5, but have to work hard to get it in. And you also have some nice ideas where you can kind of just pawn storm with h4, h6, or something like you can also go g4, g5, g6 later. Your knight will just be very well placed on e5, and that will kind of give you what you're looking for in terms of, yeah, building up the attack on their king. And then there are ways to play, like you could also castle short, but that's going to tie in a bit more to the queenside majority discussion, because normally in the queenside majority structure, you will see white castling short, like in the version of castling long, yeah, you guys have a bit more of a attacking race situation, which I'll kind of talk about more in the Caro-Kann part, because I feel like it just fits a little bit better there. But yeah, that's showing how it works. And I will also say, like, this double pawn structure, and this comment also applies to the Caro-Kann version as well. It doesn't really work if there was an exchange of knights on f6, because the structure's a bit inflexible and it's just going to be a bit hard for black to really find a safe location for their king in the long term. Like, castling long is technically safe, but then you don't have any counterplay with the queen side, with like a6, b5, and this sort of thing, which you'll often see in the burn version with like bishop takes f6, gf6. So basically, to make this work, you kind of need to have the bishop pair as well. Otherwise, the structure is kind of bad. Whereas for white, what you're really wanting is to be able to meet c5 with d5 and usually develop it that way. And if you can do that, you're usually doing fairly well. That's kind of the really what the battleground looks like. Yeah, you're not really playing so much with the pawns white. You're playing a bit more with the pieces for sure. But yeah, and sometimes you will see g3 like that is a way you can often develop the bishop. and try to beat them to the punch. But anyway, moving on to some other examples. Yeah, like this McCutcheon was specifically when white doesn't have like this bishop a3 like in the winnower. Basically, black's attack is just going to be more effective because they can get the base of our pawn chain. Whereas with h4, like, yeah, we can play for this sort of thing, but, they can just kind of defend their king side with a very small number of defenders, like king f8, rook g8, bishop e8, that sort of thing. And yeah, we can try to swing the rook lift, but it just doesn't really have that effect. And it's just a little bit too slow to really get an f4, g4, f5. So the summary is basically the structure is just quite good for black, essentially. So I was just drinking some green tea just to sort of stay sharp, and also it's kind of like those who've been following my health journey kind of ties like into the sort of the weight loss there. But yeah, this one I'm trying to remember actually why I picked out this structure. I think there was something I wanted to kind of show with the Tarasch. Oh yeah, I remember now. Like often in Tarasch French, white is sort of going to be trying to use their lead in development to get some sort of initiative. But it's also worth pointing that there are some lines where black can castle long, where they're a bit more exceptional. Like you're not really going to do it so much when you've played b5 already. But it is an idea that is sort of worth knowing about. And also when they play like queen to bishop e6, like you have a choice whether to play like h3 or g3, and but it doesn't like massively change your entry to play. Like there's not really so much to add here compared to the previous Queen's Arbitrary structure, except mentioning it, yeah, in the Tarish French. There are some lines where you can play long castles to kind of make it work if you want, but you don't have to do it by any means. Also, with this Taimanov structure, there's kind of a few different versions of it. I've kind of taken sort of the STEM version where, and you can also get it from a French Tarash, like I showed before. But mostly, even though black has more space, white does kind of have a little bit more flexibility in the structure. Somehow, where they can even time like just sit on the position. A lot of cases you will see white play e5 at some stage, kind of kicking away the knights. And it is true it does give black the option to play c5 out worrying about that pressure on the center. But you're often going to see white play moves like c4 to try to kind of resolve the structure in their favor. That if it takes, well, black's pawns get kind of split, or if they take on c4. But if they play d4, then you kind of got like this e4 square, and you can kind of try to build up an attack on the king. Now, to be fair, black does also have counterplay with a5, a4 they can also try for, but those are sort of the main contours, and I don't really want to go like too deep into it because yeah, there's like so many other structures as well. But I would say it's probably not a good idea to rush with ED5 because it just gives black a very strong center and like very good play down these files. But you can play a move like C4 and kind of keep the keep the tension and try to potentially give them an isolated pawn, or yeah, just kind of keep it so they're saying that any of their ways of releasing the tension are going to have some problems. And it's also going to be a way to kind of stop them playing a move like e5, just taking over the center, if we've got that extra pressure on d5. So, yeah, so those are some good ideas that are kind of worth knowing here. With that, we'll move on to the next one. And yeah, something's going to be a bit more rapid fire, but this one's basically an example of Caro-Kann exchange or Caro-Kann advanced variation, where the move c5 was met with c4 basically. Because I mean, we know from the advanced French, like black eventually wants to challenge the center, but rather than playing a move like c3 and black's having a turbocharged French with a bishop outside the pawn chain, you'll more often see white not play c3 and either play more with the pieces or play more with the pawns. And actually, if these pawns all get traded, which I think is what comes up in the next game, you'll see that again, we're kind of back to the Alakin Sicilian structure I already talked about before. Though I will say with the bishop on f5, it does mean that long term it's a lot better for black. You don't really get your attacking chance against the king here. So to make this work out, you really need to sort of get something happening before they castle their king to safety. Is a tip I would give. But yeah, that's like kind of like just sort of sharing a few differences between the advanced Caro-Kann and the E5 French structures that we saw just beforehand, and really understanding those tips, yeah, will really help you to like just play both systems better as such, or to kind of be able to tell which one's sort of a good version when it comes up in a different opening, like who gets the better side of this transformation, as it were. Now in this version, like basically, yeah, we already know that C5 is what black is going for, but you will often see this kind of problem in the E5 positions that I didn't explain it in the French because it kind of comes up a bit more in the Caro-Kann, but it's like both the bishop and the knight want to go to E7 because the F3 square is taken away. So that's sort of how white space advantage manifests. It kind of turns into a lead in development because say if they play knight e7, black kind of has to move the knight again if they want to develop their bishop and complete the kingside development. And white has different ideas. Like one you'll often see is like a4, a5, which looks very weird. But I think if I show you a structure in a couple of structures time, you'll kind of understand why you might see white push the a pawn and use the rook pawn as a way to create chances. Speaking of that, it actually ties into the tile variation, where if white plays h4, black will usually play h5, because if you don't, they're going to be some problems. They go like g4 and e6, and it kind of end with like this really gucky structure where black just has too many weaknesses to have a playable position. Even if the pawn's on h6, like the same concept still applies. But basically, yeah, to avoid that, they need h5, h5. But now the exchange of the light squared bishops kind of works better. And the reason it works better is it's now harder for black to just castle short and develop normally, because they kind of have to watch out for like this pawn on h5 being a bit weak, and also their development's kind of a bit slower as well. So that's sort of the basic reason. Like there are some other subtleties as well to it, but basically, yeah, it turns out h4, h5 inserting this takes previously a totally harmless move in bishop d3 and turns into a very legitimate and major weapon against the Caro-Kann. There are some more subtleties I won't go into too much, but that's just so you kind of understand why we do this sort of thing. And if we take this version of white playing c4, so this version of the structure is basically going to be fine for black, generally speaking, because they can just, put their knight on d5, or you just keep their piece around there. Like maybe they want to keep some flexibility, but the point is that the d4 pawn is backward, and that will fully compensate white's extra space here. But let's now pause for a moment, and let's imagine that the pawn's placed just a little bit differently. So let's take that idea I mentioned just a little bit earlier of white playing a4, and then the move a5. Well, this version of the structure is a lot better for white, because now they don't have this idea of playing knight to b6, d5 anymore, and even if they do put the knight on d5, they still have this long-term problem of the d7 knight being very passive. And the thing is, because we have a lead in development out of the opening, they can't play c5 so easily because the opening position favors side with better development, and that is us basically. So, and in terms of white's plans, like what you'll kind of just use the space angles to keep control and just kind of build up an attack just slowly against the white black king, like trade off their bishop. Queen might come to g4 to start bishop takes h6. The rook can swing over. Like if you know like basic attack ideas, like it's not that hard to visualize how we can manifest an attack here as white. And there's probably even some other ideas as well, like f4, f5 in some positions. But a lot of times the knight will be on d3, so that's f3. So yeah, it might be a bit hard to get in, but that at least gives you like a few ideas of like what sort of makes this really tick for white. And also h4, h5, this is a better version of white because again, you can use the g5 square. If they go bishop e7, well then you have an outpost for the knight on d6. So there's all subtleties like that that kind of allow you to outplay an opponent. But the lines can also be very move by move based depending on the version you get it in. But yeah, with that, let's now go to this sort of classical Caro-Kann structure. I'm actually going to call this one the Scandinavian structure because I kind of think with the Caro-Kann of the structure where you have like h4, h5, and h6 thrown in, which we'll see in the next one. But basically here, black's aim is they want to play the move of c5, and let's just imagine the bishop's on f5. But it's interesting that as the game goes on, it's going to get better and better for black, because as they catch up in development, the fact that no bad pawns and no bad pieces really comes into play. Whereas the fact that our knight is stuck on c3 means we can't just go c4 and just have a good queen's gambit, but it's also a little bit too slow to move the knight, play c4 and move knight back to c3 in most of the different Scandinavian or Caro-Kann positions. So it's kind of end up in a position where like the pieces are all developed, but it's just very hard to really like do anything with them as such. Which can be quite frustrating and probably a reason why Caro-Kann is so popular today, along with, of course, the Gotham chess influence. But yeah, basically that's kind of the idea that white really needs to play quite directly to use their lead in development, like use the fact that the queen is, dancing all around the shop with like queen d5, queen a5, queen c7 and stuff. And so you're going to be looking more at ideas like potentially trying to go after their bishop with like g4, maybe knight e5 and then g4 would be the way you do it. Also, there'll be some ideas where you can kind of play bishop d2, knight d5, and try to, start some discovered attacks. Like, I find that often what really makes things work in the Scandinavian white is when you can get the move d5, where it looks like it shouldn't work, but it works for tactical reasons. Because that's what ultimately allows you to use your lead in development and really show a nice advantage. So, I think as white, as long as you kind of remember the ideas of playing d5, like trying to get some tacting on d5, or trying to use a pawn storm and kind of go after their bishop and not just let them, develop quietly with a good game, because long term it's a good position for black, then yeah, that will allow you to have a very fine position. Also in the middle games, there will be some case where, like as black, you can try different ideas, like using the a pawn to sort of try to create some weaknesses, like especially if they play b3 or something. I guess that probably applies more for the Caro-Kann, to be fair, or the Fort Knox Fringe, but you kind of get the idea of how that can apply. And also sometimes you can meet c4 with b5, and sometimes that can be a way to also try to create weaknesses. Again, a bit more situational, but it's just to give you something to work with a bit more than just, okay, just play c5 and be fine. Because there'll be some positions where it might not work quite as well for some reason, because of the opening it came from. Yeah, with that also now we get to the Kablanca Caracan version, where you might think initially that this is going to be an advantageous version for white, because black has lost a lot of flexibility with the kingside structure. And not only that, but also when you castle long, you also have this clear plan of g4, g5 to use the pawn as a hook and just develop a very strong attack on the king. Because if they castle long, well, now it's hard to get in c5 and they don't really get their usual counterplay. Whereas if they castle short, that's just not really going to be a problem. But like castling long is just thought to be a very passive line. You don't really see it a lot these days. There was played by like Sebastian Karpov way back in the 70s and such, and 80s. But basically, yeah, that's kind of like showing the main ideas. Like basically, white wants to attack in its opposite side castle position with g4, g5 most of the time. Sometimes you'll see like 95 flicked in, but it does depend on the position. And black in turn, yeah, just wanting to kind of get into c5 and open up the c file and d file. And so black really is relying a lot more on piece play in these positions. And there are some rare cases like where black, for example, might need c4 with b5, like we were saying before, to kind of open up the king, or try to get some a5, a4 free as something a bit less theoretical. But those do tend to be like very situational cases. And also, it's something that's probably also worth appreciating here, if I just play a move to remove the arrows, is that the reason the endgames are often very good for black is because of this h5 pawn being overextended. Like, yeah, in theory, you could try to build a solid pawn chain, but it doesn't always work that way if, say, your knight's on f3 or your rooks are a little bit out of position. And so that's often a way in which black can really kind of outplay white, like just use the h5 pawn as a weakness, tie white pieces up, and just kind of just steadily create additional weakness to outplay that way. So that really is sort of what makes this bishop f5 Caro-Kann a really good strategic opening long term for black. But we do have these dynamic ideas like g4, g5 to kind of make up for it, as it were. So anyway, moving to the next type of structure, and yeah, like this quadrillary one is like very common these days. Like I think the appeal is that you can kind of play like bishop d6, rook e8, knight goes to f8, bishop g4. Like you can kind of play these moves like without really needing to think a whole lot. Like it's a very systematic kind of development that black is going for here. Maybe queen d7 if you want to keep the bishop to go to c7. But like it's very clear where the pieces are going. Like your knight can go to f4. So that's like very straightforward in a sense if white plays naturally. And that's sort of the reason why if white wants to set problems, they're usually going to try for provoking a move like g6 and trying to be able to get this going in this sort of way. Which is sort of the reason why nowadays you see black go h5 and like they'll try to use the h pawn to get an attack of their own on the king. Saying that a structure like this one, like they can try to set up the battery and say that white's knight is a bit tied up here, and also if white plays a bit slow, like maybe you can get counterplay with c5, and in turn white also can do something like they can try to go for like c4 and try to push it in the center. It is a bit hard to really get sort of this kingside attack working after h5, because black can just go h4 and use pawns to say, well, my king is perfectly safe and you're not really getting through in a sense. And also if white castles long, yeah, you obviously have like this very obvious like attacking like a5, a4, b5, b4 sort of thing. So those are kind of the main ideas. Like I could say more about it. Like there are some versions where you play c4 and try to be more ambitious this wide. There's also some versions where you play like f4, f5, but those do tend to be very concrete and move by move based. So I'm kind of just like referencing something you might want to research yourself more than like going too deep into the weeds of it. But with a pawn f5, like obviously that kind of dominates tonight. You can sort of see the value a pawn f5 would have for white if we just put it on the board. You kind of get the idea. So anyway, yeah, with that we can move on to some of the exchange Caro-Kann lines, and this one, to be fair, it is a Carlsbad structure, very classic. So it's something that really kind of it fits better for part two, like for the Carlsbad structure, like say, this sort of version in the D4 sidelines. The thing is, though, in the exchange, you do have much more active diagonals for your bishops. That's kind of the thing you have going for you. And it's also going to be a bit harder with like getting bishop g4 and get their bishop outside the pawn chain. Like say, for example, if you had h3 and instead bishop f4, like they're not getting it. Bishop g4, and like we kind of have to rely on playing the IQP structure if they want to really equalize. And also, you'll also see people play g6 in the Caro-Kann and try to trade off the light square bishops, saying that that's our good bishop and that's their bad bishop in the structure. But I do think white is a little bit better because the bishop on g7 is just really stuck behind the granite wall. And I mean, also, like the e5 square is a very good square for our knights. It just allows us to build up an attack very naturally. And also, the minority attack's often less effective for black as well, because without bishop being more active, we're just kind of in a better position to exploit some of the weaknesses left behind. Like, sometimes we can even play like b4 as a way to really stop their b4 attack. It tends to work better when they can't play like a5, a4, stop knight b3, but yeah, these just like a few subtleties that again I think will make more sense when I go into more deeply in part two, but this is like the sort of the surface level, let's say. So moving on to, and you're also going to play more with the piece in this kind of structure in case that wasn't obvious. But I mean, if there was a pawn break, yeah, like maybe you can push the rook's pawn, but again, it's very much depends on the position. But piece play for the most part will be fine. Whereas in sort of you're going to be black more trying to make the pawn play work. If not, like try and trade some pieces to relieve the attack. But anyway, as it happens, yeah, this IQP. I mean, this one comes up a lot in the Panov Botvinnik. Like we've already sort of talked about it a lot. Like kind of the difference is that in lines like the Panov Botvinnik and Nimzo, the bishop might be on b4. So you might see some versions where you have like bishop c3, bc3, and this kind of hanging pawn structure. But I feel like that ties a lot better to d4 opening, so I'm going to kind of talk about it there. But there's nothing like too special about it. Like the Panov Botvinnik like is about as classic an IQP position as you can get. So the stuff I mentioned before is just going to apply once again. Now, a structure that is a bit unique to Panov is when you get this move of c5, and I find if black gets an e5 quickly, it just doesn't really work. Like it blows up a little bit in white's face. But if you do have that really strong control over e5, like knight f3, bishop f4, bishop f5 sort of moves, then it can work very well because black's counterplay often will be more relying on knight e4, bishop f6, but it is a little bit slow. Because if they play b6, we can kind of just defend it, and we also, yeah, just have this very clear plan of moving the majority forward. You might notice in this structure definitely some parallels compared to like a Ragose with colors reversed. Again, that ties a little bit more into like the D4 structures, but yeah, just kind of showing a different way you can get those sort of positions on the board and use space to potentially outplay the opponent. This one, I'm going to pause a little bit on this one because this one comes from the Two Knights Caro-Kann. And specifically, the reason I've included the bishops and the bishop and knight here is because it's the version with bishop g4 takes f3 that we're referring to. And what you'll kind of notice with these sorts of positions is that black basically has got their pawns very nicely complementing their remaining bishop with Kablanca's principle. And I've noticed that the best approach white are often going to be very patient, where you kind of just play like bishop e2. And you kind of play it almost like sort of a King's Indian, but with colors reversed, and just kind of leveraging the long-term advantage of the bishop pair. So that if they do try to open things up, you can kind of like use it to your advantage. And black in turn, yeah, is often like try to play on the queen side, like try to get something moving there. But it is going to be a little bit slow in a sense. Like sort of an unusual King's Indian tactic, but you can compare it to that. But there's also the approach of playing d4. Obviously, I didn't mean to to cheat in chess as such. But there is also d4. Like if they take, you kind of get this similar structure to what we saw a bit earlier in the French, but where or Caro-Kann, but where you've got like that bishop there as well as space to work with. So a little bit like a Fort Knox Fort Knox French, if you know that kind of system. And if they don't, well, I find that in a lot of cases actually is better to keep the tension in the center. Because even if you sort of gain the tempo of e5 to kick their knight away, they kind of just go c5 and their pieces end up being really well placed to attack your center. Whereas the fact that you kind of have a bishop versus a knight, it makes it a lot harder for you to defend the pawn. And okay, like there are exceptions where you can make this work as white, but it's not the reason why I would probably prefer a more patient approach. I just build up steadily behind the center and say, okay, I've got the space, I can take my time. It's sort of the idea. Kind of fine. Like I'm talking so much, I'm almost losing my voice slightly. So just gonna take a moment, yeah, just to I'll show you the next structure first of all, just so you can kind of like process it a little bit. But I'm gonna have, yeah, a little bit of tea just to rest my vocal cords. Actually, it's kind of insane, like how warm this tea stays and firm. It's like one time, like I left this boiling tea for 12 hours, and like it was still like boiling hot, like almost afterwards, like it was still like barely drinking. So yeah, that was kind of funny. But so then this structure of E4 versus C6, it basically comes from like the D3 Caro-Kann line, like this modern one. And okay, the reason that this structure isn't just like this line isn't just like much better for white is that white has played like King D1, so you do lose some time like getting your king back in position. But you're also making it very hard to go E5 and just equalize in that way. Like even if they do, like somehow your piece is sort of better positioned in the arising play, like with some very natural sort of moves, as it were. And often what you'll see black do is like if they play G6, it's usually not with the idea of bishop G7, because then their bishop's just very misplaced, but they're usually, trying to get some bishop H6 and like trade some pieces to relieve the crown. There also are some really creative ideas that come up as well, but like in modern chess, you'll often see people actually moving the rook's pawns. Like if white goes H4, like the structure loses that little bit of flexibility somehow. And if whoops, didn't mean to do that, I meant to do it like yeah, these are really going crazy today. But yeah, this is what I was going for. But if black gets H4, yeah, you can kind of like grab some space to sort of play around this pawn. The idea of F5 and trying to open up the position is not you see all that often, but it does exist. And also there's some other ideas where you can go like G5 and sort of say F3. Yeah, if F3 is played, you can kind of go like G4 and try to create counterplay this way. And in turn, white's often going to play like A4 and yeah, some of these expansion ideas like I kind of mentioned before. These are like some deeper subtleties, like for most people, it'll be maybe a little bit advanced, but if you do play the Caro-Kann as black, or if you want to play this D3 side as white, these are sort of the structural ideas that I'd outplay even some very strong players. So really tying into understanding what structures like a GM. And with that, we get down to more of the sidelines, like this Pirc structure. Basically, the key idea is that the bishop pawn is a bit misplaced on G7, and we can use that to kind of have a small advantage. Like we can place our bishops more actively and just have some annoying pressure. Like if they go C6, maybe we go A5, and make it so that if they try to fight the D file, maybe the pawn on A7 hangs in some lines. Or if they play A5, like, yeah, they can do it. It's a good positional move, but we have that lead in development we can kind of use to, say, put the bishop on a nice long dagger, well, not long dagger, but an active dagger. So, yeah, that's just like just showing some basic ideas. Like, I don't want to go too deep, but just keeping in mind the time. But it's just like just showing out some basic conclusions. Like, if you take this period structure, you'll kind of notice it sort of will often lead back towards basically an accelerated dragon structure, but it's a better version because they lost time with the knights and they can't get their queenside counterplays easily, that sort of thing. So yeah, so just kind of following standard ideas. If they do play EC5, then yeah, it's kind of like it can either be like a King's Indian or, you can also take on the sons as such. And also a structure like this, yeah, you just kind of have the space advantage in a symmetrical structure. Kind of ties into some like Alakin with ED6 sort of things. If you play C4, let's say. Anyhow, let's move on to some other things. And again, like this sort of a bit rapid fire, but basically with the C6 plan, like White's plan is pretty clear. Like, bishop H6, H4, H5, make their king if they castle short. And even if they don't castle short, bishop H6 is still quite annoying because it keeps their king in the center. And it's going to take a long time for black to castle long. And even when they do, their king's still a little bit weak. As the very famous Kasparov Topalov Vakanze 997 game showed. Like, I think if you've watched a lot of YouTube chess videos, like, there's a good chance that you've probably seen that game by now. But if we want to understand in terms of black's counterplay, like black's counterplay is going to be like they can play for moves like e5 later. That kind of ties into what we are just looking at before. But more often, it's going to be moves like b5 where they're going to try to create some counterplay on the queen side, especially if we castle long. Now, if we have the pawn on f2, we actually kind of have some more flexibility where we can kind of sort of switch to a 150 attack, where maybe that b5 might not feel entirely in place if we just play more strategically. But yeah, those are sort of subtleties. If you play the Pircs as black, you kind of should know. And if you want to sort of outplay opponents and make the most of your advantage, again, it's good to know a few of these ideas. One can play the move A4 in some cases, but it doesn't really gel well with F3 because then you lose the option of casting long, so it just makes the whole battery a bit less effective. There are a few other points, they're not really related to the structure, so I'll kind of leave it at that. Yeah, this structure actually is one that comes from the Hand-Filidor, so the lines where they have like 97. And there's really a lot of different ways it can play out. I think the first thing I noticed is you don't really want to rush with releasing the central tension too fast, because then you just lose your central space advantage, or like if you play D5, well now either, you're going to take with a piece and you get a Najdorf structure, but one that might actually be okay for black, or you go ED5 and again you sort of, yeah, given black like a little something with the central majority. So, but you can sort of see how it kind of, how a lot of these sidelines will sort of transition back into more familiar structures in certain cases, which is why it was good to start with the main lines and work toward the sidelines at the end. White's main plans are going to be usually ideas like moves like A5, where you just are taking the space, kind of making it harder for them to keep that sort of flexibility of the structure, because that really is kind of why they're playing the Philidor. They're saying, okay, you might have more space, but your knight has been inflexible, it's dominated by distance 4, and it's not so easy for you to use that space advantage. Well, there are also ideas where you can like go for a fianchetto. You could also play like H3, that's a very popular move these days. And also some other plans can also include things like even trying to swing the knight around for an attack. But the main thing is just to be patient. Like don't sort of try to win the game right away, but like slowly improve the position, kind of let black sort of stew in their own juices of like not having enough space, like not having a good square for their C8 bishop, but if they play B6 or now D5 might gain in strength. When they can't keep that pawn so easily on C6 without some weaknesses forming. So yeah, you're kind of just like using the opponent's moves against them. Like if they go A5 and they, try to go for some like Antischen style structure. Well, yeah, now the structure, like maybe we don't have such an easy pawn break, but we also don't really need one because we've got the extra space and we can pressure D6 given enough time. And this could just be like a very healthy way to position your pieces and just steadily build up while like tries to make something work with the knights, but not really entirely succeeding somehow. Yeah, but those are kind of the main ideas I wanted to share. Like, those are the main structural points that are good to know. If you want something a bit more direct, there are some other ways to play it. But before I get to that, I do want to talk a little bit more about the surrender to center structure. It's obviously a bit different when the pawns are back on their starting squares. But this Amsterdam Philidor structure I think is a very nice one for white. You kind of notice the big problem that blackface is that their dark square bishop is a little bit passive. And the two ways you can really take advantage of that are basically to either go for this English attack style pawn storm. The reason we put the bishop on f4 is that after c6 we have that pressure against the pawn, which makes it harder for them to, get their counterplay with d5 or with b5, b4, which are kind of like the main plans for black, other than like trading the knights and, going a6, b5, this sort of thing. Trying to again go for some sort of pawn storm on the queen side. But you'll kind of notice that white's attack is just a lot faster and a lot more effective because we have the extra space. So it's much easier for us to bring pieces to the defense, to the attack, and back and forth. Whereas it's much harder for black to do the same. And like, yeah, even if they get in like b3, well, usually we have an knight d4 that's covering it. So it's just not that big of a problem for us somehow. And usually we've got some pretty big threats going against their king by then. If you want to play it more strategically, you can also play like g3 and kind of get some structure like this where you kind of build up more steadily. Like maybe you'll have a black, try to get some counterplay at a5, but just gonna like play very patiently. Like just very slowly build up, but kind of where your king is a lot safer than on c1. So that's like the more patient approach. Like it's not really right or wrong, but it's just kind of the way of playing it. Black will often be trying to make some d5 work, but if you can meet it with e5, that's usually going to be pretty good in reply. So like something like this to give an example. Because obviously if the pawns get traded, yeah, then it's back to the open center structure where you lose your space advantage. Yeah, moving to this one, like there's also this idea in the filler where you can go g5, and it's something that, yeah, probably it's not really things much for structures, but I just want to mention the idea does exist if you want to explore something a bit more dynamic. Now for the Geller setup where you have like this and like knight f3, bishop d3, you might notice it's actually very, very similar to what we saw in the Roy Lopez in the Italian, but where there's a bishop on g7 right away is a difference. And I do find these positions are a bit better for white. But again, the key is just to be very patient, like H3, knight F1, knight G3, like slowly expand on the queen side. Maybe for knight C6, you might play D5 and transition work would kings and in if they played some slightly harmful moves for that structure. Again, kind of depends what they do as well. But yeah, it's kind of there's definitely a lot of parallels to the Venus and the Royal case because of that E5 E4 E5 structure. And from Black's point of view, like the way you normally equalize is going to be to either keep very flexible, or it's going to be to sort of find a way to like get in D5, like liquidate the center and equalize. I will say I do think knight D7 is a better set than knight C6 if possible, but you don't really want to play C6 because I think it's going to weaken D6 a little bit too much. So those are kind of the main ideas to sort of work with there, like just be patient, build up steadily, and kind of let Black stew on their own juices in a sense. As for this Tiger's modern structure, like I'm showing it mainly just to kind of show that this plan, it basically, if it works, when it works, like it's going to often lead to a kind of Dragendorf type of position, or it might lead to a situation like, say, if they meet C5 with D5, like it's kind of a good Benoni where they got the space already. So really, with the Tiger's modern, the main point is it's going to usually transpose back into other systems, or like other structures, I should say. If you do play A4, like there are some ideas where you can kind of, fix their structure. They can play it like a Hippo, but I kind of find in the Hippo like these H4, H5 ideas are just a really nice way to kind of get some initiative before they really complete their setup. There are also going to be some versions where you can kind of play like a D5 and sort of transition to a really good King's Indian type of structure, but they can't really get an F5 properly because they're just like a little bit too far behind development to sort of make it work, especially if the bishop is on b7, where obviously it's quite misplaced in the structure. So remembering like the bishop b7, d5 can kind of be a nice pre-own for us. But yeah, that's sort of going a little bit specific, but the Hippo is something that does annoy some people. So it's good to know kind of structurally how we can sort of dismantle it. And obviously here we're assuming knights on c3, because obviously you can play c4 and stop b5, yeah, that obviously makes a6 a lot less effective, but that's one part two kind of point. And yeah, just to kind of conclude with, I believe this is this one is the final structure. This is one that does come up with the Alakin. You don't really see it that much elsewhere. So in the Alakin, the pawn's on c4, and black usually plays g6, so you're not really facing questions so much of like black playing e5, because it just doesn't really make so much sense, without the kind of necessary support. And also in the Alakin, what kind of really makes this work is the fact the knight is very misplaced on b6. In fact, there are even some fun ideas where you can try to attack the knight, but that is like very, let's say, unusual and creative. More often you'll kind of see why just sort of build up a structure like this where they're just going to just play very solidly and kind of make the point that black doesn't really have a great pawn break. Because if d5, c5, we kind of kick their knights and just have, again, a really good version of the Taimanov structure from before. And if they play like d5, you kind of have different options where I would say the one thing I probably wouldn't do is play d5 too readily, because that kind of gives like a good version of some of like the Najdorf Hedgehog structures I showed from before. Instead, it's going to be better either just to keep tension and sort of leave black struggling coordinating, like maybe, wait for a good moment to play like c5. Or you could also just take and just kind of say that you just have a much better version of the queen time majority structure, because their knight's misplaced, you have your majority moved a lot further forward, and also it's kind of hard for them to move their pawns forward because they're behind in development. Our bishop might be on c4, so those are kind of the main ideas to sort of work with in that case. And if black doesn't play with the pawns, I mean, you just have a space advantage rather permanently. You can't really complain too much about that. So yeah, with that, that basically concludes all of the structures. And yeah, I know this is a very long journey. Like this is the longest training video I've ever recorded. And well, previously I wasn't really able to record it because I kind of was in my home and it'd be like different interruptions. I kind of like lose the flow. But here in this office space, actually like my wife's nail salon, that you see here, like this makes it easy like to go really deep. And yeah, I was like actually had a lot more fun with this, I think, than I expected to. Like even though it took a very long time to cover all the E4 structures, I think it's very much like sort of evergreen where like you just keep coming back to this one and just going like to the section that you want to look up and just kind of, learn from it that way. So do let me know in the comments like your feedback, like what parts of this video this train really found the most useful, what things, if there's something like you would like me to do more of, like some topic suggestions, and feel free to share that as well. But yeah, with that, I'm going to take a well-deserved rest of my voice. And yeah, I wish you good luck with applying these pawn structure ideas in your own games. And like I said before, like basically just remember like the 4 steps. Like we covered step 1 of what are the structures. We covered step 2, how to play the structures, like what the key ideas are for both sides. And now it's on you. Step 3, play these ideas in your own games. If you want to really kind of understand, like a GM, make sure to play through some full games and kind of notice the patterns I mentioned when they come up, when they work, maybe when they don't work so well. And with that, yeah, I wish you luck on the next step in your chess journey. Do click the link in the description if you want to continue with some subsequent logical steps. And I will see you in the next one.